and early on a Saturday morning to hear this exciting culmination to our 4 days of very, very hard work. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you so much, Dr. Rigby, for that very warm introduction. I hope we can live up to the hype. Some notes on a safe space. So the content and discussion in this presentation will necessarily engage with issues of human trafficking, which can include sexual and physical abuse. Some of the content will be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with. Myself, the other moderators, the presenters, and all others who are speaking will do our best to make this virtual meeting a space where we can engage bravely, empathetically, and thoughtfully with the difficult content throughout this symposium. As an icebreaker, if you think you may be the person living furthest away from where we are in Richmond, we'd love to hear from you in the chat box with your location. We've had attendees from Ireland, the UK, Australia, and Romania, Long Island, New York City, Boston, Connecticut, Buffalo, Oregon, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Florida, Alabama, and California. A lot of us are also in Richmond, which is totally awesome too. And with that, I would love to introduce our speakers for this morning. So as Dr. Rigby was so kind to kind of allude to, this morning is kind of student run, which is super unique and super exciting. I'm really glad that I got to work with this group over the last year to put together or help put together this symposium. It has been a really, really great experience. I know that my education is better for having worked with them, and I know that I'm going to be a better doctor for having worked with them. And sometimes I hope that just by being near them, I gain IQ points by osmosis. So Taylor Walters is joining us. She is an M1, very involved in immigrant and refugee health. She's previously worked with the International Rescue Committee on work with resettling refugees. And I'm also very interested in this topic and know almost nothing about the intersection of that and human trafficking. So I'm really excited to hear from her. Gurjit Singh Bajaj is an M4 going into psychiatry. Carrie Shadowin is an M4 going into OB-GYN. Congratulations to Carrie. Her work was just recently accepted to present at a conference, and I have been lucky enough to get to work with her on a project related to the effects of the COVID lockdown and domestic violence. So she is doing lots of very cool, exciting things. And then Ben Blake is also an M4 who's been super involved with this group, and he is going into internal medicine. And again, I'm David, and I won the lottery and get to go into pediatrics. And so with that, I am going to hand the floor to Taylor. So Taylor, good morning. We are so excited to have you.
Hi, thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. Let me get my screen share. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep. And Taylor, I have your poll, so just let me know when you're ready for me to launch that.
Perfect. Great. And I'm going to I think I'm going to have a newfound appreciation for all my professors who do Zoom University after this. My name's Taylor. Thank you so much for having me. This is a really full circle moment for me because this time last year, I was a working adult. I had just started working in the realm of foreign national victims of human trafficking, and I knew nothing. And one of the first people I was talking to about this was Mary Lee in the I2CRP program, and she recommended this symposium that I didn't know existed. And I came, and I was here on a Saturday, so I heard the student speakers, and I learned so much. I met Faye, who ended up being such a huge support of me personally and my work, and the collaboration with the International Rescue Committee. So, I hadn't even interviewed at VCU at this point. And so now here I am, and the I2CRP program is part of my life. So it is very full circle for me. I really appreciate you guys welcoming me to speak today. Just a note, I adopted a kitten this week. If you hear tiny little kitten noises, that's him. He should settle down as I get going. And if you see this little red star on the presentation, that's just a reminder to myself that I have a poll question. There's just a few, just to kind of get a pulse on the room and get your all's input. And so we can go ahead and launch that first one. It's just to get an idea of who I'm speaking to. I think it is mostly students, but just curious, and I'll give you guys whatever, 30 seconds to answer this first one.
So just answer the first question. I didn't make them individual, sorry guys, but just do the first one.
So it does look like you have to answer all 3 of them before you submit, but I'll just pay attention to the first one for now. You can put random answers until we get to those later questions. And Carrie, if you see that everybody's already answered, you can go ahead and close the poll.
Couple more seconds in case anybody lingering wants to answer.
Okay, great. So mostly medical students, some physicians, other healthcare workers. Wonderful. All right, do I click? Let's see how I do this. Okay, great. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I came to work in this realm, and then what David asked a great question. What does refugee resettlement have to do with victims of human trafficking? We're going to talk about the program that I worked in. It's called Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, or TVAP. We're going to do a little bit of a case study just to give you an idea of a kind of typical client that I would work with, and then some future considerations as M4s move on to become practicing physicians, and as Richmond as a community moves on to engage more heavily with immigrant populations. So before, I was a medical student, so I got my master's in public health at the University of Virginia, and at that time I was interning with the International Rescue Committee, which is a refugee resettlement agency. And then after I finished my master's, I did an AmeriCorps year with them, working in the intensive case management program. So I worked with a small subset of our clients who had more needs than usual on account of mostly physical and mental health care. So I worked very closely with the International Family Medicine Clinic. If there's anyone joining us from the UVA world, that's my favorite place in the world, and a really, really wonderful example of integrated healthcare for refugees. So really great experience working with them. And when I finished up my AmeriCorps year, I got a job here in Richmond as the health liaison, also with the IRC. And in that role, I moved away a little bit from case management and more into education and outreach. So educating not only refugees about the US healthcare system, but the US healthcare system about refugees. So Richmond, as of now, does not have this really well integrated medical home for refugees. And so it was kind of my goal to get a pulse on who is working with immigrants in Richmond, who are my people I can go to in the healthcare world, who takes Medicaid, who uses an interpreter, things like that. But then in about this time last year, probably December 2019, I was approached by my boss because we had been getting requests from another resettlement agency in Northern Virginia as to whether or not we worked with victims of human trafficking, foreign national victims of human trafficking. And the answer at the time was no, but we kind of started to explore this program, and we'll get more into the specifics. But it ended up kind of getting incorporated into my job to do intensive case management again. And that's kind of why my boss approached me about it, because I had that experience. And so I went to the Trafficking Symposium. I learned all there was to know. Not really. I learned a lot on the job and as I went. But so then our office started working with foreign national victims of human trafficking. And then I got into med school and I kind of left the IRC. So I am by no means an expert, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of my experience with this population in the time that I did work with them. And so so why, why refugee resettlement? Besides the fact that these are two immigrant populations, why would they exist together? And the answer is that they are both housed, these two offices are both housed like next door to each other. So the Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration for Families and Children, and then underneath the Administration for Families and Children exists both the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Office on Trafficking in Persons. And so the refugee resettlement program in the United States is fairly well established. I mean, we've been doing this since the early 1980s as a formal program. And so kind of all the rules and rights and access to services is very well established. And so when the Office on Trafficking in Persons was looking to see, what services are we going to say are across the board provided for these individuals, they said, let's give them the same services as refugees. And, that's literally how they define it on like their website. It's they are eligible for the same services as refugees. And so then obviously the logical place to kind of put that program then is with refugee resettlement agencies. And so, just a little bit about refugee resettlement, because that could be, a whole other class. But in the United States, there are 9 national agencies that resettle refugees on behalf of the US State Department. The ones relevant to this conversation, the International Rescue Committee, where I used to work, and one of 2 resettlement agencies here in Richmond. The United States, I always forget their big name, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and their local affiliate is Commonwealth Catholic Charities, which some of you may have heard of. That is the 2nd resettlement agency in Richmond. And then the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, USCRI, they do not have a local affiliate, but nationally, they hold the grant for the Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. So anybody, in other cities who works within that program reports to USCRI. They handle the funds, they handle the reporting, they handle the, like who goes where, like they track where everybody is. And so this is how I would find out that clients had moved to Richmond, were living in Richmond, plan to one day move to Richmond, things like that. And so also, a logical reason to help these clients within refugee resettlement agencies is because of the services that exist in our office, the, well-established things that happen in our office. And that includes resettlement and placement. This is kind of the, stereotypical 90 days, very intensive services. We help clients with everything from airport pickup, finding their first apartment, furnishing it, getting their kids in school, social security cards, public benefits, their first jobs. Really everything. It's a very comprehensive program. And then economic empowerment is within our office. The matching grant program, this is, kind of another conversation, but basically for every dollar that the resettlement agency provides in volunteer time or in donated goods, the Office of Refugee Resettlement will match that program, that worth of that. And so it's a work first program. All of the programs in the United States for refugee resettlement are work first, versus if you were to go to like Canada, the refugee resettlement programs are a little different, but we are a work first program. Our offices also do career advancement. So, it's not just 90 days. Our offices will follow clients for up to 5 years to provide services for new Americans. Cultural orientation is a huge class, the English as a second language, and then, refugee health education and outreach. And this is what I did. And this is kind of the program that I worked in. That is actually funded by the state. So we used to be called the Office of Newcomer Services. That just changed this past year, and we are now the Office of New Americans. But that is the Virginia program that follows the different resettlement agencies in Virginia, tracks our progress, funds these amazing programs. And just for y'all's reference, the refugee resettlement agencies in Virginia are in Northern Virginia, Fredericksburg, Harrisonburg, Roanoke, Charlottesville, Richmond, Newport News. So, I've had the wonderful experience of working in both Charlottesville and Richmond and, kind of compare and contrast. And then just to give you an idea of the clients I was working with in my refugee realm, this data is a little old, but it tracks pretty true. Congolese clients make up the majority of the refugees that we're resettling. The Afghanistan number is deceivingly low because we help Afghan clients who are actually special immigrant visas much more often than they are true refugees. And again, this is, a rabbit hole, but the special immigrant visa program is for Afghan nationals who worked on behalf of US interests in Afghanistan. And because of that work, they are at special risk of persecution in their home country. And so this program was first established for Iraqi citizens and then moved to Afghanistan. But we resettle a lot of SIV Afghan clients in Richmond, but then pretty closely followed by Congolese as well. So, that's refugee stuff, and that's what we provide. Then the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program. So this is a federal grant. It's held by USCRI. They have subcontractees, which, IRC in Richmond was. And we get reimbursed. So that's kind of like why would someone do this? That's kind of why. We get reimbursed for case management hours. So for my time, we are reimbursed. And then the clients, they are given to us by USCRI. They are eligible for 12 months of lifetime services. And it doesn't have to be continuous, which is why this program works with, affiliates all over the country, because someone could start services in one place and then decide to move because of work opportunities or family, and they could pause their services, move, and then restart services and get the full 12 months. And then also this is, federally funded. Every person can access up to $6,000 for case management and eligible expenses. And so this is like, the textbook definition of eligibility. But someone has to be born outside the US. They cannot be a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And, for the many things that I had to kind of learn as I went with this program, this meant that even if I found out that one of the refugee clients I was working with had experienced trafficking in their lifetime, they were not eligible for this program because they were already a lawful permanent resident. But the, kind of what we get in return then is that someone does not have to be a certified victim of human trafficking. If ever I came across somebody, and sometimes I would get local recommendations for clients, they could be a potential victim of human trafficking. I could enroll them in the program, and then within 2 weeks, we had to request certification. And then, if they got it, they could stay in the program. And if not, we had to disenroll them. But most often I was getting these clients who already had certification. For minors, it's a little different. And we'll talk about in the case study why this kind of gets a little crazy. But minors, you just have to have reasonable suspicion that they experienced trafficking at some point in their life. And they receive what's called an eligibility letter. And that letter gives them access to the public benefits, same as a refugee, without, going through the whole process of HHS, so Health and Human Services certification. So the Department of Health and Human Services, they are the sole, people who decide whether or not someone has truly been, a victim of human trafficking in their eyes. And so these are all the services provided through TVAP. So, this very quickly became a huge part of my work. And some things were, tangible, like basic needs, help with housing, help with, filling out public benefit applications. And then some things were a little more like case management level. So like safety planning, like having conversations with someone about like, are you safe in your community? If you had to leave your home, like, who would you call? Where would you go? Do you know emergency numbers? And then, like, the big thing, I mean, I'm sure you guys have been talking all week about safety planning when it comes to victims of human trafficking, survivors of human trafficking. And then add on top of that with these clients that most of them do not speak English and they are culturally not familiar with the United States. They don't know what services exist. They don't know the, the emergency numbers. And so a big part of this program is education for clients, for myself, and for community partners, because, so for some of the different government workers that I was interacting with, this was the first time they had ever heard of such a thing. Like, they didn't know that those services existed for these people. So I have another little, polling question. So all three will pop up again. Just focus on that second question, put whatever answers you want for the other two. But
actually, Taylor, sorry to interrupt. I redid the poll, so it should just come up just the second question.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So when looking at this, laundry list of information, well, I guess first, does anybody have any questions about what any of these things means or looks like? Sorry, I should have said that before I posted the poll.
Hi, Taylor. I have a question.
Yeah, please.
My name is Courtney. I'm a fourth-year medical student, and I was wondering, how difficult is it to get these services? Because I'm thinking of like Medicaid. You're allowed like a prepaid or a cell phone, but it requires internet access to go to the website. You have to be on the phone. Like, you can be on the phone for hours with the insurance company. How hard or difficult or easy is it for the refugees to get these services?
Sure. And that's kind of what a big part of the case management aspect is that we kind of do it on behalf of clients for a lot of things. But we really have to be clever. So, people with children get free internet through the schools, and then sometimes kids come home with laptops. And so it's all this kind of seeing what is in the community. And that is a big part of this program, especially when we do our reporting. We have to demonstrate to USCRI that we have tried to the best of our ability to get, community services, low cost, best options for these clients. So, the way that you and I would go about getting different services is just, it's made 100 times harder, and you have to be, a little more crafty about it. But no, it's a great question. And you're right. I mean, when you start kind of thinking through, how would I do this if I didn't speak English, didn't understand public benefits, didn't have internet access, couldn't get to the office by bus, like on and on and on and on. It can get overwhelming. And that's why, we plug them in with case management services that are well established, because I've known case managers who were former refugees, and they could do this with their eyes closed. And then it's just explaining it to clients that, like, yeah, this sounds crazy, but like, we're going to be with you every step of the way to help you work through this. Any other questions on these? And if not, Carrie, we can go ahead and launch that second poll. Looking at this laundry list, which of these services do you guys think would be the most time intensive? So, Courtney, that was a great, segue into this. Which one do you think would be most time intensive for a case manager or client?
Are you gonna eat?
Is that a question? Sorry.
No, I think that was someone unmuted by accident.
That's okay. And then same, Carrie, if you see that, everybody's answered or most people have answered, you can go ahead and.
A couple more seconds for any last minute votes.
Oh, you guys, right on the nose. Yeah, legal services. It's definitely what I spent the most time in. I wanted to, highlight a few of these just to give you an idea of what these services look like working with these clients. And definitely legal services was a big one. So the first thing, we have to consider as case managers is how easy is it to spend $6,000 in 12 months when you consider that some of these clients are new to the area, need somewhere to live, have utilities, rent. Maybe they only own, a few outfits, a few changes of clothes. They don't have access to transportation. They don't have a cell phone. They don't have, personal items like the things we need to take care of our bodies, food. And then kind of like on top of that, this number actually turns into $3,600 for direct client expenses, because about a third of those funds are for case management hours. So for $3,600 in 12 months, I mean, if not yourself, you can probably think of someone who could spend $3,600 in a month or less, definitely less. And so, this is where it becomes very important to access community services. Obviously, when we think about rent being the big one, a lot of these people who were referred to me, they were actually living with family members or living, with parents if they were minors. So we could definitely help them contribute to rent, but it wasn't like we were paying mortgage on a house every month. The money would be gone in a minute. So we were very crafty with the way we did things, and also relied heavily on donations to our office. And we at the IRC would have like a refugee store and a donation store, and our clients were able to access that as well. And that was especially useful for personal items and clothing. But now legal services. So, these are just some of like the initial hurdles that I had to consider, is like finding a professional person to do pro bono work, and then determining eligibility. So this is the biggest sticking point about the current model, is that foreign national victims of human trafficking are pursuing what is called a T visa, literally like a trafficking visa. But the Department of Health and Human Services is what works with benefits. The Department of State is what determines eligibility for legal status in the United States. And apparently, in my experience, those two offices don't communicate ever. Because though the Department of Health and Human Services will say, yes, this person experienced trafficking in their lifetime and they are eligible for the same services as a refugee, the Department of State says that to be eligible for a T visa, someone must be in the United States on account of trafficking. And so what that looked like for some of my clients is that though they experienced trafficking in their home countries and fled their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution, very similar to the definition of a refugee, they were not in the United States. They did not cross the border to be labor trafficked in the United States. I certainly did work with those clients as well. I once had a client who was labor trafficked in the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a U.S. protectorate. And so when people became aware that he had been labor trafficked, he was immediately eligible for services, immediately eligible for a T visa, and it became very easy process, not easy, straightforward process for him to be on track for a green card and then for citizenship. But especially for minors, it's especially minors coming out of the Northern Triangle, this is a huge sticking point for them. And so there are alternatives available. I mean, the asylum program exists in the United States, but this was not January 2021 in Biden's new administration. This was Trump 2020, maybe going to be Trump to 2024. And it was a very discouraging time to be working with clients who were not eligible for this very straightforward visa. And, always the heartbreaking part was if a client was eligible for a T visa and was, found eligible for that, their eligible family members could then apply for what was called a T derivative visa. And then they were also eligible for the pathway to a green card and citizenship. And this includes parents, children, and then even siblings of someone who was a certified victim of human trafficking. So, this process could change families' lives. And when it was found that they were not eligible, was incredibly discouraging. And then, amongst all of this is the waiting game. And so that kind of came to this like important balance, which is legal status versus work status. So in refugee resettlement, clients arrive in the United States on track to receive a green card within 1 year, on the track to citizenship. It's, all very by the book. But with these clients, it became more of this gray area because the client would not have legal access to work in the United States until after their T visa had been approved, which sometimes could take between 12 and 18 months. And if you guys remember, the program's only 12 months. The money, it just doesn't make a ton of sense. Always a thing I kind of have to calm down about. And so, and it is not, and we're all aware, it's not that people living in the United States do not work without legal work access. That's just the truth. But to be in a case manager position and kind of have to talk to clients about this and wanting them to be economically self-sufficient, but knowing that what I'm telling them is not that they have legal access to work in the United States. It was always a very, very tricky conversation, a tricky sticking point, but something we did have to, talk about pretty quickly. So public benefits, if anybody, I'm on Medicaid now because I'm an older med student and I'm not on my parents' insurance. So if you've ever filled out the Common Help application, this is not, it's a long process for yourself, let alone, for someone else. And also in Virginia, it's not the same in every state, but in Virginia, you have to have a Social Security number to apply for public benefits. And so foreign national victims of human trafficking are eligible for what's called a non-work Social Security number. So it is a Social Security number granted to them for the purpose of applying for public benefits. And so I was like, awesome, I'm gonna head down to the Cary Street SSA office at 7:30 in the morning, and I'm gonna apply for the Social Security number for this client. And then I'm gonna fill out this application, and then they're gonna get Medicaid, and we can make doctor's appointments, and everything's gonna be great. And as you can imagine, that's not exactly what happened. And so, this is an example of, I was working with SSA officers who had never heard of such a thing, had never heard of a non-work Social Security number for a foreign national who was a certified victim of human trafficking. And at the time when I was, young and didn't know, they were like, no, does not exist, not eligible. So I drive a client home, I come back to my office, I call my contact person at USCRI, and they're like, no, this is what you tell them. So then I march back to SSA, apply for Social Security numbers. I finally found like the one person in the entire Richmond office who knew what I was talking about. Him and I became best friends. Filling out the Common Help application. And then this was another interesting point because on occasion, I was applying for benefits for a minor who lived in a home with adults who were living in the US unauthorized. And so then this became like a whole thing, is like, do I say outright that that's what's happening? Talk about if clients were distrustful, God forbid that I put them in an unsafe position. So, I had a great contact in Albemarle County, which is near Charlottesville, someone at that DSS office who I trusted, above anything. And so, I'd call him and I'm like, can I say this on this application? And it turns into a whole thing of like, who do you trust? And am I always doing what is best for the client? So, this became a whole other thing with Common Help and then finally getting benefits. So definitely not as straightforward as it sounds on paper. And then, the reason you guys are all here, the mental and physical health care for trafficking clients, like any survivor of human trafficking, the number one thing I'm looking out for is their safety, and for it to be client-led. Anything that we do is client-led. Sometimes, the roadblock we'd run into is that clients weren't aware of what services were even available to them. So then it's a conversation of education and then also consent, them consenting to the services, consenting to the information that I provided to the healthcare provider. Because, that question doesn't come up in your normal PCP appointment. Like, oh, are you a survivor of human trafficking? Like, trauma is not talked about all the time in PCP appointments. And so this kind of difficult part of case management is that a lot of the times clients will assume that anybody who they're working with is on the same page, that if they have told me one story or like have disclosed information to me, that anybody who then works with them is kind of all on the same page about that information, which is just not the case. We sign a release of information very specifically about the personal information we are allowed to share about a client. And so, and these are some of the questions to think about. Does the provider even take Medicaid? Do they literally use an interpreter? And then do they successfully use interpreters, which is not always the case, because even in med school, it's, we talked about using interpreters for about 30 seconds during that one PCM workshop, first week of school. And I'm like, we're going to talk about this again, right? But that's another project I'm working on. Trauma-informed care. So, by definition, all of these clients have experienced trauma. Is it being discussed? And then, also the difficult part is just the same with refugees. And, we've talked about, we'll get into a case study that illuminates this more, but how can a client discuss previous trauma if they are actively being re-traumatized in the US because of their legal status, not being able to find work, not being able to support themselves, not speaking English, being in a new culture, on and on and on and on. Is the client even open to mental health counseling? As with refugees, this concept of, talk therapy is very foreign. Are clients open to the difference that could make in their lives in expressing, their history? Will the clients be receptive to the provider? And then, like the logistics it was the major part of my work, scheduling, transportation, follow-up, on and on and on. Okay, so now here is our case study. Just so we're clear, this is not the real name of anybody I ever worked with. This is, a prototype, but this is Maria. She's going to be our case study for today. And she was 10 when her mother left El Salvador to come to the US, as many people, in Latin America do, to look for better opportunities. And Maria was left in the care of family members. She was an extra mouth to feed in a country where it was not always easy to provide for everybody in the family. And at 15, Maria's family members facilitated her being sex trafficked by a local cartel. So she fled the country. And, we've talked, in the news, not so recently, but within the last couple of years, talking about the migration of people out of the Northern Triangle through Mexico into the US border. And I'll just say this little bit, even though we are not talking about it as much, the half-done refugee camps that exist on the Mexico side of the US border, is really going to be a huge human rights thing that we as a country need to work on in the next soon bit. So at 16, Maria entered the US as an unaccompanied minor and was placed in ORR care. So if we remember, ORR from previous discussions is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So when someone under the age of 18, 18 is the arbitrary age that we set as the United States. When the Department of State identifies someone who's under the age of 18, they are considered an unaccompanied alien child, and they are then put into the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I shy away from calling them detention centers just because I know the imagery that brings up, But that is what ORR, one of the functions that they do is organize for unaccompanied alien children to be put in care homes until, their cases can be processed. And, they're either connected with family who live in the US, or they go to court, whatever it may be. And so for Maria, what happened is she was placed in an ORR care home in Arizona. And then she was reconnected with an uncle who was a green card holder and was released to his care. During her time in Arizona, she spoke with different people at that facility, and at some point told them her history, and she was found to be eligible for an eligibility letter as a minor, as a victim of human trafficking. But as we'll get to soon, there was kind of a catch with that. So she arrives in North Carolina with this eligibility letter. She quickly leaves North Carolina to be reunited with her mom, who is living in Richmond, who is living in the country without documentation. But she still has this eligibility letter. She is referred to me as the service provider in Richmond, and then we go to work. Oops, sorry. So the first meeting with these clients is a long one, because it's not only explaining all the services that are available, but it's also doing a comprehensive needs assessment. So after our first meeting, these were some of the things that I identified that were needs for this client. Because she entered the country as an unaccompanied alien child, she was in removal proceedings. She had a court date set to be deported. So, that was kind of top of my list, but her physical and mental health care needs, her needs for identifying documents, public benefits, having a cell phone so that I could reach her, so that her mother could reach her. She was already enrolled in school at the time that I met her, so that's why that's not on this list. So we've got one last polling question for that. So looking at this list, I've got my chronic disease standardized patient next week. So, ranking things from acute to chronic, which need is the most pressing to you in this case?
We'll give a couple more seconds for any last votes.
Great. That's actually really wonderful. And the answer is, you're all correct, but I agree. The money for basic services or for basic needs was something that I could address immediately after the meeting had finished. There were some things that for the client and for her mother were probably top of the list, and I would argue to say that was probably removal proceedings. But as far as the things that I could, as a case manager, kind of map out, what could I do tonight? What can I do within the first week? What do I do within the first month? And we did. That's part of case management services, is to write that out, goals over the following months. But absolutely, money for basic needs was something I was able to do right away. And then pretty quickly after, some of these things have to go in a certain order, like we talked about. So, getting the non-work Social Security number, then doing public benefits, then getting Medicaid, so we could make the doctor's appointment. That was very important, but kind of had a laundry list of things that came before it. But that's excellent. Thank you guys for your input. And so, by the time I left the IRC, I didn't always get to see the end of these cases, but 6 months after services, this is where we stood. Maria was thriving in school, learning English so quickly. We actually did a bus orientation, and she was able to use public transportation independently, just to be able to, see Richmond outside of walking distance of her home. was eligible for SNAP, was connected to Crossover Clinic, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, which is just, I can't say enough nice things about. The bad. So if you recall the story I kind of told of how Maria came to be in the United States, she was not in the US on account of trafficking. She had fled a trafficking situation, but was not in the US on account of trafficking. So she was found not eligible for a T visa. And so then kind of like where we left it, what alternate forms of immigration relief was she eligible for? Was there going to be a change in administration that made those alternate forms of immigration relief plausible? And then just kind of bigger picture questions, like right now she's enrolled in public school, which is just a wonderful thing that children, undocumented children, have access to. But what happens after graduation? You know, what happens after she turns 18? So those are kind of the things we're left with. It can be very easy in case management to be very problem and like solution oriented and tick off the boxes of things that I can absolutely help with. But then you have to be prepared to sit in this uncertainty of questions that you don't know the answer to. And certainly the client doesn't, and help them work through how to process that. And so, you know, these are, I know I'm running a bit long, but these are just some of the lessons that I learned along the way. Ask questions, you know, and I'm not saying always to the survivor who's in front of you, but to people who you may know more than you do. So coming to the trafficking symposium last year, I just couldn't say enough nice things about it, because I mean, not only did I meet Faye, but like I became aware of like the trafficking hotline. And earlier last semester, I actually ended up using the trafficking hotline because I saw red flags that I became aware of as signs of domestic human trafficking that I didn't know before I attended the symposium. So ask questions, forgive yourself. You know, as future providers for vulnerable populations, we will not always be perfect. I think there are ways that we can prepare ourselves as to not re-traumatize an individual, but it doesn't always mean that we are going to ask the question in the perfect, correct way, and not, you know, make ourselves feel bad. As an example, I was enrolling a client in services, and this was a male client. And, you know, for a lot of kind of underlying reasons, I assumed that he was a labor trafficking client. And so part of the paperwork I'm filling out asks certain safety questions regarding his history as a survivor of human trafficking. And we're kind of having this roundabout conversation, and I don't understand what's happening. And we kind of backtrack 9 steps, and I'm defining human trafficking. And I ask if that is something that he relates to. And it turned out that the answer was yes, but the answer was that he had been sex trafficked. And so, you know, that was an emotional brick wall, like to hit, but also then hitting like policy brick walls of just feeling so discouraged with this whole T visa process. But, you know, then the other thing is like to be confident enough to advocate for your clients. So, you know, me going back to the Social Security office, I had to come armed with information and be like, I understand that you don't know what's going on, but I do. And I think this is how we can work together. Roll with the punches for sure. Some things that came up that I guess I never expected is that working with clients who lived in communities who did not have access to the same services as him, he actually ended up having to move housing because of the discrimination that he was facing in his community. I mean, there are so many immigrant populations in the US that don't have those same access to services as refugee clients. And it put him in what we considered an unsafe situation because of people questioning, well, who is this? And why do you get that? And, you know, trafficking survivors not wanting to disclose their history to every person they meet. It was a pretty difficult sticking point. And then collaboration, you know, just as future providers, we may be working with a vulnerable population, but not even know how many services exist in the communities for that person. And also what a source of information a caseworker can be in an exam room. I mean, especially in my work with refugees, I sat in on many an appointment. And it was really important for me not only to have all the same information, but also to be a source of additional information, you know, to be that other part of like the past medical history to kind of chime in and be a support for the client too, because then I could, you know, later on say, oh, I remember, excuse me. I could say to the patient later, oh, I remember the doctor saying, you know, X, Y, and Z, and these are how we can help you get access to those things that they recommended. Because, you know, again, for as great as providers we want to be for vulnerable populations, something I ran into a lot is that doctors make recommendations that are unrealistic to the lived experience of clients. You know, it's just, I could go into a million stories about that. But, you know, so I would take that information of what I heard the doctor say as a recommendation and make it realistic for the client. So use caseworkers. If someone has a caseworker, invite them into your exam room, use them as a source of information and support. I can't say that enough. And then, you know, never stop learning, never stop being afraid to ask questions, to admit what you don't know, to use the experience of others. And this is not only, you know, from other providers who work with victims of human trafficking, but from individuals who have lived these experiences themselves. Humble yourself to the point where you can admit that you don't really know what it's like to be in their shoes, but to hear their lived experience and allow that to change your perspective. And it'll change your perspective on everything. Okay, and there's kind of like, you know, next steps, big dreams. Richmond, we are ready for Richmond to just take off as a site of refugee resettlement, integrated care for immigrants. But, you know, it can't just be the 9-person office out on North Hamilton Street at the IRC office. It has to be like a really big community effort, not only in healthcare, but social services, the other nonprofits that work with immigrants and refugees around the city. Because when that coalition is built and information is shared, we don't duplicate services and clients get everything they need to be successful and to be self-sufficient, which is, you know, the ultimate goal. And then obviously education for all the other people who exist in Richmond who don't have that same access to clients that we do. Sorry, now you can hear my little guy. So education being the big part of that as well. Because really when you start asking questions, and this is definitely what I found in Richmond, and especially with VCU, I've been so pleased to see how open VCU providers are to working with refugee and immigrant clients. When I just asked, you know, they didn't know that existed, but when I asked, they were like, yes, absolutely. So if you want to get more information about, you know, some of the topics I've talked about today, I highly recommend checking out for like technical information. Check out the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program. It's listed on the Office on Trafficking in Persons website. If you want to get connected locally, the IRC in Richmond has an Instagram and a Facebook page that they update very regularly. You know, they're doing a big coat drive today, even in their parking lot. So, but also, I mean, plenty of other places that are serving refugees and immigrants, and especially the undocumented or underinsured populations of Richmond. Crossover Clinic, Caravan through Bon Secours. I cannot say enough nice things about what an ingenious, clever program. And then the Sacred Heart Center as well. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all the support and getting this presentation together. Thanks for your participation. Really, it was such a joy to talk to you guys today, and let me know if you have any questions.
Hi, Taylor. We have a couple questions in the chat I'd love to relay for you. So
Awesome.
A question about disclosure. If a T visa relies upon knowing that a client has been trafficked, how much pressure does a victim or a survivor feel to disclose, even if they are not ready to do so?
That's a great question. And The answer is to their case manager. I would never I would ask a client to disclose to their comfort level. And, if the only thing I ever really learned was that it had happened at some point, then that was all, I learned. For a T visa, it has to be very specific. They have to be on record, written out, their entire story. And not to say that, the legal system is callous, but it can be re-traumatizing. And myself and the lawyers who I worked with really prepared for those moments. And we sought out, interpreters who were trauma informed and really tried to make it as easy a process as possible. But I would tell clients ahead of time, I don't have to be in the room. No one else has to be in the room, but this is the story. I mean, we ask that you tell your story truthfully and to the best of your ability to the lawyer so that they can advocate on your behalf. It's not to learn this information to be curious. I mean, it's to advocate for you to get the services that you are owed and the legal documentation that you are owed. So.
Awesome. And this question is from Carrie as well. Taylor, how important is native language fluency in your work with these clients, i.e. your ability to speak Spanish if working with Spanish speaking clients?
That's a good question. And I think that anybody who is fluent in Spanish, especially, moving forward, is a huge asset. For me personally, I don't speak any other language. I'll be upfront about that. I think when you're working in the refugee realm, it is significantly less important because the populations who we are resettling change constantly. I would say, obviously being able to speak Spanish is not a skill you learn overnight, but a much more possibly useful skill is how to best use an interpreter. What the best practice is for using interpreter, because then that translates to any language, to any client who might be in front of you one day. Whereas, certainly your Spanish speaking patients, if you speak Spanish, that's a huge asset to them. But, we resettle refugees and the US welcomes immigrants from all over the world. That speak languages that I had never heard of before. So, as a future physician, I think a much arguably more important skill is how to utilize interpreter services and have that rapport.
I had a question, Taylor.
Yeah.
This was really great. Thank you again. I was just wondering, like during my third year rotations, I had some experiences where we had a patient that would come in that was a refugee with their case manager. And I was wondering if you could tell me the best way, because I've experienced where I assumed, maybe incorrectly, that the case manager would provide information based on just why the patient was there, maybe why the translator was getting set up and things. But I was wondering if you had any like language I could use to like ask the case manager, like, is there something that you've discussed with the patient beforehand that you can talk to me about? Or what's the best way to determine quickly the relationship between the case manager, the patient, and now me as a third party coming in, when some people know some things and some people don't know other information?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one easy question is, besides asking the client, like, who do we have with us here today? And then they can kind of introduce the case manager, and then directing to the caseworker, what is your role? Because, it might be something like, oh, I'm just here like for transportation and to take notes during this appointment. Because, especially when I worked in the intensive case management program in Charlottesville, I would sometimes send my interns with a client and they were there to take notes for me because I had another appointment I had to be at. But sometimes, I was there to make sure that a client brought up a certain need that they had discussed with me, and make sure that the doctor heard that. So I think asking, what is your role is a great way to ask that. And then especially I found at UVA in the International Family Medicine Clinic, one thing that they always made a point to ask me was, after the conclusion of the appointment, asking the client if they had any other questions, directing towards me, Taylor, do you have any other concerns that you feel need to be addressed today? So that's kind of just a couple of easy ways. And not all case managers are built the same. And I hold myself and the people who I've worked with in very high esteem, but that doesn't mean that you won't run into some people one day in your practice who, like, you don't know why they're there, or they don't know why they're there. But those are a couple, tricks I would say that have been helpful.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
Taylor, I'd love to ask, as you saw that there's a ton of medical students on here. So there's going to be a bunch of people here that will be taking care of these people in the near future. And so I think you have like a really cool and unique perspective that you watched doctors during these visits as like a patient's kind of best and fiercest advocate. I'd love to hear from your perspective some things that you saw doctors do or say that made you cringe and you're like, oh, I really wish they didn't just ask that or say that. Or as well as things that maybe as you're leaving the visit, you're like, man, I really wish they had done this, but didn't.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Sorry, I should have prepared for a better answer for that, because it's, it's something I talk about a lot. But I had the experience to attend the North American Refugee Health Conference 2 summers ago, and I was part of a really great talk from a psychiatrist who's based out of Wright State in Michigan, and it was all about asking about trauma history in primary care. And I think that's huge. I think that like some of the other awkward questions that we learn to ask in patient visits. And when we asked him, where do we start with this? And his answer to us was asking a patient, asking a client, what's the worst thing that's ever happened to you? And it seems, very harsh in the moment, but you're eliciting, a real story there. And I think that can kind of open up a lot from the patient. I don't know why someone would ever ask this, and I don't think any of you guys would. I've had physicians ask before, like in the context of it being, if someone being an immigrant, asked like, why are you here? Like, it wasn't a context of like, why are you in this office? It was like, oh, like what brought you to Richmond? Yeah, that was a cringy one. I don't even know what to say about that one. Don't ask that. I think eliciting, a lived experience from the person in context of their US life to make recommendations more usable is huge. I mean, that's huge for any vulnerable population. But like following up, like when if you say something to a client, and especially with refugee clients, they are sometimes from cultures where doctors, the relationship is very paternalistic. So like the doctor says something to you, you say yes, and then you leave, and then you don't do anything they say because you can't, and you don't have the money to, and you don't have the access to. So, if a client is, or a patient is very much just kind of like saying yes to whatever you do, engaging in shared decision-making, I think is a really, really great skill. Eliciting their responses and their concerns to the things that you have just said, I think can be incredibly useful. Yeah, sorry, those are just some things off the top of my head. I'm sure I have a better, written out answer somewhere, but.
That's super helpful. That was kind of a loaded question, so sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's a great question.
I'm really glad you said, don't ask what brings you to Richmond. Like, I definitely have done that. In just like making small talk with people, I often ask, oh, like, where are you from? How'd you end up in Richmond? Like, kind of what brought you to the city? And it is good for me to reflect on how inappropriate it is to ask that question to people that are here for like traumatic reasons. So I definitely have made that mistake multiple times without like even giving it any thought. So this is like really helpful for me to reflect, and I will not be doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to give an apology to Taylor, because when I was doing the introductions this morning, I did not realize that her talk was part of our lineup. And I think David has just uncovered an excellent topic for her talk next year to us, because I think there's a lot more she can share with us. And I look very much forward. Faye actually came to me at the end of the Saturday's conference last year and said, there's this great person and we're really going to work with her. And then when you got into medical school, I got another conversation with Faye about how great you were going to be. So I very much look forward to you being one of the future leaders of our human trafficking group. And thank you very, very much for an amazing talk.
Oh, thank you so much. It means a lot. Yeah, it's deciding to come to VCU was just I was at absolute peace with my decision because of, you know, the students and the faculty and the community partners that I saw who were engaged in the learning for these students. And I'm, really excited to be here. As crazy as this marrow exam is going to make me on Monday, I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, so thank you so much to Taylor. Taylor, I want to second what Dr. Rigby said, that we're very lucky to have you, and that we have all heard lots of very, very good things about you from Faye, like since I met Faye. So it is great to get to meet you in person and get to work with you a little bit. And we do look forward to like getting you involved in coming years, because I think you are obviously very engaged and can do lots of very cool things that we have not figured out how to do ourselves. So a huge thank you to Taylor. And yeah, as she mentioned, she does have a big exam on Monday. So we're like double lucky we could get her to speak with us today. So with that, just one kind of logistics thing. In just a second, we're going to have Gurjit speak. I think we'll take like a 2-minute break just in case you need water or run to the bathroom. And we will start the next talk at 11:11. After that, we'll take another short break, in which point I will give my talk, and then Carrie and Ben. At the end of the day, we're going to post the survey. So if you have not filled out the survey quite yet, Ben will post the link at the end, as well as the QR code if that is easier. So I will see everybody back in 2 minutes at 11:11.
Great. And thank you guys again for having me. It was a joy.
Great. Good luck with Marrow on Monday.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So welcome back, everybody. That was a really quick break. But we are now going to hear from Gurjit. This is a topic I'm super excited to learn more about. I think social media and misinformation, not just in the realm of human trafficking, but in every aspect of our society, is like an extremely relevant, pressing, important topic. So I'm really excited to hear how this applies to what we've been talking about all week. And with that, I kind of pass the floor to Gurgis.
Thank you, David. So yeah, I'm gonna focus, on basically two major aspects. The role of social media in how traffickers use it in their kind of operations, and so kind of how we as in anti-trafficking efforts can kind of use it the same way. And then kind of a detour, the role, of misinformation, particularly things that are going on in recent months to years, have been playing in human trafficking efforts. So to start off, I think just a key point is that social media and the internet in general is just increasingly playing a role in human trafficking. It's true for every aspect of our lives, and it only makes sense that it's going to be relevant to something that's so pervasive. This past March, the FBI released a PSA identifying how traffickers continue to use online platforms to facilitate trafficking. And what it was kind of aimed at was aimed at the public to kind of say that the social media apps we're using, the dating apps we're using, aren't these safe spaces. These have been ongoing efforts that are increasingly becoming popular for traffickers to use. They put out a few cases, and I'm just going to read one of them to sort of highlight how traffickers use social media. So in July 2019, a Baltimore, Maryland man was convicted on 2 counts of sex trafficking of a minor and 1 count of using the internet to promote a business enterprise involving prostitution. The perpetrator identified 2 girls after they posted information online about their difficult living and financial situation. After meeting them in person, the man forced the 2 girls into sex work. I chose this case because it identifies a few ways that traffickers are using social media. One, to highlight vulnerabilities in individuals, keeping in mind what we post on the internet, it's not safe, it is public, anyone can find it. And then 2, how in their ongoing operations, social media is key to their enterprise. So, there's so many methods that traffickers use social media, but the key point is that, human trafficking is a business with a very valuable product. It's worth a lot of money, and it's very easy to find buyers. And so traffickers are using social media just as any other business would, in terms of finding their product, in terms of selling their product, and just their daily operations. So one of the key things is social media and recruitment. So this is in some ways finding their product. This is kind of done, social media is used in a lot of ways to identify victims. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. So one of them is, creating this kind of online relationship. And I think this is something that's become more prevalent in recent years as the kind of hiding in, I think in the early 2000s, people were anonymous on the internet. They used usernames, but as we've used real names, people have been meeting real people online, which developed from virtual to real life relationships. So traffickers have been able to use this in a lot of ways. So sometimes traffickers will create entirely fake identities, use fake pictures, fake bios. Sometimes they'll use the identities of victims that they already are in control of, use their profiles to either create a romantic relationship or a friendship with a new victim. And sometimes they can just blatantly use their actual social media profiles with real pictures of themselves and aren't really hiding who they are. And generally, it's generally a slow kind of process. They build trust like anyone would. You like images, you post relevant comments, and then often, particularly in sex trafficking of women, there's this concept of boyfriending, where there's this transition from a normal internet relationship to, flirting and flattering and eventually wanting to meet. And one of the things is that it's really common for a trafficker to ask to fly, to pay for a ticket to fly their victim to where they are. Traffickers have been really smart to use the kind of location-based services that a lot of these apps offer. So things like Tinder and other dating apps, you can localize the people you're looking for. So they can do this in 2 ways, either to find people who are in the city they're at, if that is what works for their operations, or to find people specific to cities where they are not, so that there's a geographical, gap once they're starting to traffic them from their hometowns. Another kind of way that traffickers use is this idea of like a fake or deceptive job listing. So generally, this is more so relevant with labor trafficking, but it's definitely also a part of sex trafficking as well, where there'll be postings on places where it makes sense to be looking for a job. Facebook and Craigslist, like classified ads. These listings will be they'll look a little off, but there will be something about them that's alluring, largely due to things that, they can't happen. The pay is much higher than, is realistic. They're somehow paying for your housing for, a minimum wage job. They're going to help you with immigration when they're targeting migrant workers. And so things like Facebook and Craigslist are popular, but also messaging apps are really common, particularly with migrant labor trafficking. Things like for Asian communities, there's certain messaging apps like WeChat that are more popular. In America, WhatsApp is commonly used for all types of immigrant populations, but in terms of trafficking, it's really common with Mexican or other Hispanic populations to use as a source of trafficking. And the idea is that a lot of people find there's some sense of legitimacy when it's posted on the internet or in writing. So they find it more trustworthy compared to if they just meet someone on the street or see a flyer, even if there's nothing about the listing that really is trustworthy. So this is an example of a post that was it's like slightly modified to make it anonymous, but it's something Polaris put out about a listing that is seen on Facebook. And it's something that it's similar to stuff that I've seen in my Facebook feeds. It's there's a couple of things that when you look into it, it's suspicious. Get out and see the country. The idea of cash every day is always concerning because you're wondering where that comes from. But it's very alluring to people because they get cash every day. And then of course there's this idea at the bottom here. It's we don't want the take out the negativity when you're talking about this if you're antagonizing it. And so the next component is once a trafficker has their their product in a sense, how are they advertising? How are they selling it? So we talked a little bit about this yesterday about the website Backpage, which was at one point the leading internet source of human trafficking. It's estimated that at one point 80% of online trafficking went through this page. And in 2018, the FBI raided it and shut down, and the creators of the website have since pled guilty to multiple counts of human trafficking and things like that. Since then, a lot of how traffickers use the internet has changed, and they're using traditional social media for advertising. So again, things like Facebook, Instagram, and dating apps. The big difference now is that this advertising is a lot more discreet. So a common thing that'll happen is that either the trafficker or the victim will be posting a suggestive or explicit picture on their social media page, and it'll have a normal caption, but in the comments it'll be hints like a phone number or suggestions of a price. And for people who know what they're trying to buy, they know what this is in reference to. And so it makes it a lot more difficult to crack down on it because it's not centralized. There's no consistent way. There's no way to find this. Facebook isn't going to look for every explicit picture and crack down on every single comment. They're taking down the picture because it's explicit, not because they think it's a trafficking scenario. Often these listings are on a victim's own page, like on their own social media, and it's not even the trafficker advertising it. The trafficker is coercing the victim to do it, and it makes it seem at least somewhat consensual. And then a final thing that I thought was really interesting and really concerning is how traffickers use legitimate business pages to advertise their products. So in the case of human trafficking, this is relatively straightforward. They're selling a legal product, but they're using illegal labor in the process. So they're able to just advertise their companies. And for example, if it's a cleaning service with trafficked workers, they're able to advertise a seemingly legitimate cleaning company. In the case of sex trafficking, it's often coincides with other related but legal businesses. So things like strip clubs, things like massage parlors. And so the legitimate business will be advertising on Yelp and Facebook, and they won't be advertising their illegitimate services. However, the reviews on them are almost always in reference to the sex products that they're selling. So a Yelp review that's giving them 5 stars is maybe referring to 5 stars to the prostitute or the trafficked person, to the sex that they bought. So again, it's hard to crack down on that, because how do you prove that that's a illegal review, but what they're reviewing is the sex that they're buying. And so this is an interesting chart about the change in how victims are communicating with their buyers. Increasingly, phone and email has been becoming less common, whereas text and social media have been more common. And this is just kind of highlights the trend of how how traffickers are using different methods to communicate with their buyers, and often more directly now. And then a final aspect is how traffickers use social media to control their victims, before, during, and after their trafficking situations. So this is from a Polaris survey of survivors who left their situations. And in some ways, the percentages don't necessarily matter, but it's more the various methods traffickers used and use social media. So the majority of victims in this group had access to social media, but a lot of them, most of them had something going on with it that would be atypical. So a lot of them were restricted, meaning, their trafficker was reading through every message or limiting who they can talk to and things like that. A lot of traffickers would stalk and monitor them. So use location services to know where they always are or who they're talking to. We talked about being advertised on social media, and then things like being harassed, traffickers posting revenge porn or threatening to out them and spread lies on social media are ways that they can control their victims, and then hacking and impersonating them. So in a sense, while I was a little surprised that a large portion of victims have access to social media, in some ways that access gives traffickers more to use. They have more data on what the victim is doing. They have more abilities to control them, and it makes it more difficult it creates this illusion of control for the victim in a sense as well. I think this quote kind of highlights that from a survivor. They said, social media really was a piece of reinforcing all that grooming that was happening. Because I felt I was connected with the outside world, but I was only allowed to follow other girls in the game, so it reinforced all those social norms. It highlights that the traffickers are using the social media to just make it seem like this is the day-to-day and what they can expect forever. And then finally, social media in trafficking it's ever evolving. Traffickers are really quick to adapt. They are more willing than us to experiment with how they're going to use these in their operations, because not much can go wrong with trying something new like that. In 2015, up to 55% of victims met their trafficker virtually, and the use of online advertising is increasing, and street advertising is decreasing. As much as 75% of sex trafficking victims are advertised online now. And just to touch on other things that are evolving and currently happening, but virtual trafficking is just an increasingly common issue that it's just hard to deal with. Things like cam shows and OnlyFans, where people are purportedly consensually selling pornography. A lot of people on there are being trafficked and are being forced or coerced into it. The use of revenge porn and online pornography that isn't posted without consent often is associated with trafficking. And then finally, the idea of like backpage alternatives. So I talked about how that website was shut down a few days ago, but if you Google Backpage, after the first 3 results about how it shut down, the next like 30 are Backpage alternatives. So it's not like we were actually able to shut down these operations, they just changed names. You cut off one head and 3 more appear. So and then kind of on the converse, how can social media and technology be used on the other side by a victim and by anti-trafficking efforts? So as a tool for trafficked persons, the biggest benefit in my mind is that social media is portable, meaning it's not tied down to something that a trafficker will always have access to, because it's not tied to a phone number, it's tied to an account. So one can make an account and only utilize it in places where the trafficker does not have the ability to see it. Furthermore, social media has the ability to communicate with people in a more private manner compared to phone calls and texts, because they have things like end-to-end encryption, they have disappearing messages, and often people who are able to get out of their situations use social media as their primary means of communicating with others, as their way of communicating, connecting to resources, and reaching out to loved ones when they are trying to find a way out. There have also been a lot of cases where people who are leaving the situation and don't really know where they are use location services and apps to identify either what city they're in or what part of town they're in, so that they can create their routes to leave. So there's some studies that say that up to about 19% of people, of survivors that left their situation, utilize social media in their exit, and about 20% used private messages on social media as a way to communicate with service providers. So they weren't necessarily using typical methods of communication that we often offer. This is, I think, another interesting case. I think this is from a Polaris report. So a woman approached me one day in a hotel and gave me her contact information on a piece of paper. She told me that if I ever needed help, that she would help me. At that time, I didn't know that she was a service provider with a safe house for human trafficking victims, but several weeks later I called. Talking on the phone was not safe. Instead, we did a lot of private messaging over Skype and Facebook, which felt safer to me, due to the fact it was easier to hide than the phone calls. And eventually, months later, those private message conversations led to my first escape or exit. So I think this highlights how a survivor can really use these, a tangible way these services, social media networks can be used, knowing that it can be more secretive, more secure than what we are typically offering. And then kind of on our end, what can anti-trafficking efforts use social media for? So a big one is things that are commonly done, things like survivors using it to speak out about their experiences. It's in some ways what we've done on this symposium, advertising our symposium on the internet, and then having survivors talk about them to new audiences. One thing relevant specifically with labor trafficking is reviewing jobs online. So there's, we have typical websites that we often see for kind of white collar jobs about how we're reviewing them, but these exist for kind of labor based jobs as well. And there's specifically websites aimed to for migrant workers to review the jobs that they're being offered, and they pose questions about, is the money that they advertise accurate? What is the housing situation like? Are they actually, or if they say something about immigration benefits, is it legit? And these are aimed at migrant workers, particularly to make sure that the hassle of immigration is worth it for them, as well as to highlight whether if it's an abusive type of job or not. And then some things that, happen to some extent, but can definitely be worked on, are making resources more accessible through social media. A lot. So for example, we're trained to give, the hotlines and the text lines, and those are probably our best resources. And increasing those same resources in the context of social media is definitely beneficial. Making Facebook messaging bots that can talk through, like having Polaris create one of those, and making them more discreet. Because as these text lines and hotlines gain popularity, they in some sense lose some of their efficacy because you can't hide them from a trafficker as well. So creating a multi-headed approach where you're constantly having new avenues to communicate with victims is essential, because traffickers will over time find out about these resources and make sure they're not obtained. And then targeted advertising, it's kind of an ethical gray area when it comes to something like this. But the idea that we can, when people are in their bubble on Facebook, for example, that quote about how that victim was in this bubble where if she's only friends with people who are in the game. If we advertise to those pockets of people, it makes those resources available to people who otherwise would have no way of seeing it. There's obviously questions about how this is stereotyping people in our advertising, but the opportunity to, open some people's eyes to something that they might not have even thought about is definitely there. Another somewhat controversial topic is the idea of using social media to collect evidence against traffickers. A lot of this has to do with imaging data and facial recognition, which unfortunately has a lot of racial biases in it. But it is something that states are increasingly using by using social media information to identify traffickers. And then again, as I've said before, just spreading information to everyday people, making sure people have accurate and useful information about human trafficking and what it means in our everyday lives. And so this is an interesting social media campaign. I think in Ireland, it's relatively old. I think it was in 2014. But what it's depicting is, so they posted on Tinder these pictures. This was kind of the first profile photo. And as you scroll through, you see the kind of makeup removed and this person becoming progressively younger, and then giving an advertising about human trafficking. And I don't think it's necessarily been replicated. And again, there's kind of concerns about how you're making a fake person on Tinder. It's not listed as an advertisement, but it's an interesting way of how we're targeting a population that, again, wouldn't otherwise see this information, and are targeting them where they are, and kind of informing them that this trafficking is happening on the service that you trust so much. So, using social media in a way to deliver this information to populations that otherwise wouldn't see it is definitely essential. And then, so I'm going to take this kind of detour about misinformation in human trafficking. And it definitely relates to, as we use social media to kind of, have people involved, have people knowledgeable, we run the unfortunate and inevitable issue that we're going to have fake information everywhere. I'm going to focus on basically the QAnon theory, conspiracies that have been happening in recent months. The misinformation regarding human trafficking extends far beyond just this, but I think this is just so relevant to our everyday lives, it's hard not to talk about it because of how much we've seen this in the news recently. So first, just background on what QAnon is, because I think like I've seen this on the news. It's like, okay, I sort of know, but not really. So QAnon started a long time ago. In October of 2017, a user who named themselves Q Clearance Patriot posted a thread on the poll board of 4chan titled "Calm Before the Storm." For those of you who don't know, 4chan is an anonymous social media board where people post about like basically anything, and it has a series of sub boards with focuses. And so this was the poll board, which is the political board. and the users named, they gave themselves this name because they claim to be a high-ranking government official with Q security clearance, and that's kind of where it came from. The initial posts in that October were really specific. They gave posts about detailed plans how former President Trump was going to, in the coming days to weeks, was going to essentially, him in conjunction with the FBI and Department of Justice are going to indict several key politicians in the context of this massive conspiracy that centered around human trafficking. This is, by and large, a right-wing theory. However, it largely implicated Democratic politicians, but did include a few Republican politicians. And the general consensus is that it's largely an anti-establishment theory in general. And these initial posts said that I believe in that November of 2017, these indictments were going to happen, which, as we know, didn't. But for whatever reason, these kind of this QAnon gained this kind of level of notoriety, level of trust on the internet, and the movement has since continued to gain in popularity. It was initially a very internet-y movement. It was on websites like 4chan and later 8chan and Reddit. And interestingly enough, those websites have actually done a lot to kind of curb the spread of these theories as early as 2018. But regardless, it spread to Facebook and Twitter, which have since not successfully been able to really do much at all to spread them. So it's largely this very Twitter and Facebook-based thing now, with kind of the new information still being posted on some of those websites, but it doesn't spread on them as much. This is an example of one of what they're called Q drops. It's the posts that that Q would post, and they use a lot of hidden terms and abbreviations, and kind of you have to decipher this. It's not obvious to what it means, and so there's communities of people who are reading through all these, trying to find hints within these posts, as well as hints in whatever the politicians are doing to figure out what's going on. And ultimately, the movement grew, and the theories grew with them. And since then, it's just kind of everywhere. The theories are as simple as a global conspiracy of actors and politicians and wealthy people who are trafficking humans, to getting far more extreme than that, saying that these same people are not only trafficking them, but they're literally eating them, and they're using their blood to obtain a substance to prolong their lives. And then a lot of these somehow delve into 9/11 conspiracy theories, JFK, conspiracy theories, things like that. And it's really just spiraled into a lot less cohesive of a thing. But at the same time, it is somehow involved millions of people, both online and in real life, at political rallies. And it's just become really just a lot. And it's spread through so much of our day to day. At this point, the identity of QAnon isn't clear. It's unclear whether it's one individual, multiple people posing as the same person, a group. And in some ways, it doesn't matter at this point. The ideology has spread. So coming back to human trafficking, why does this matter? So the big thing that happened this past summer is it sort of started, this movement has sort of delved into current legitimate anti-trafficking efforts. So one of the key things is, so in this past summer, in about July to August, the QAnon movement started using the hashtag Save the Children. So Save the Children is a humanitarian effort founded in 1919 that really doesn't actually focus much on trafficking at all. They focus on things like poverty, education, food access all around the world. And they've been using the hashtag Save the Children for years now. Over the summer, the hashtag was co-opted in recent months, and to a lesser extent for a few years, but really gained in popularity over the summer. And on July 31st, during the UN's World Trafficking Awareness Day, the Real Deal Media, which is an independent news network, which kind of has been involved with other conspiracy theories, kind of launched these Child Lives Matter rallies. And they were QAnon-based rallies about human trafficking. And over the coming months, there was hundreds of rallies that propped up over the nation that were based off of the QAnon human trafficking conspiracy theories. And so in that August, Facebook temporarily banned the hashtag because Save the Children was being used on QAnon conspiracy theories, talking about how, politicians were implicated and things like that. And it became really difficult because legitimate anti-trafficking social media posts are being mixed in with these same posts. So Facebook temporarily banned it, but they created this kind of feedback where, as it was banned, it surged in popularity on Twitter because it was banned on Facebook. So then there were more posts talking about both the conspiracy as well as the censorship of the conspiracy. And it kind of created this effect where it amplified it more than anything. Regardless, this hashtag was used to increase the spread of these theories and blend in on social media to be harder to kind of track down. The difficulty with this whole thing is that, so there are some key anti-trafficking organizations have spoken about these theories, among them Polaris, World Without Exploitation, and KidSafe. But the difficulty is that there hasn't been a lot said by the kind of government agencies that we trust about these things. The FBI has commented very little about QAnon as a movement, and generally they're focusing on other aspects of it, generally the political ramifications of it, less so the human trafficking side. But most of what has been discussed isn't public knowledge at this point. A lot of it's leaked reports or just nothing at all. So it's hard to know what to do with all of this and what it really means. However, some of these anti-trafficking groups have kind of discussed the potential impacts on the efforts. And I think Polaris is probably the group that's been most vocal about these. And sort of the impacts that these movements have. So the first is that it can really deplete resources. So during over the summer, there's a lot of like conspiracies going around, and as is gaining in popularity, people were calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline and giving them tips. And the thing about this is, so these tips, when the hotlines get these tips, it's very labor and time intensive. And even if it's not legitimate, they have to do some digging on it and try and figure out a little bit about it. So as the hotlines become overwhelmed with tips about things that weren't real and weren't relevant, and it took resources away from victims who needed to access the hotline. It made wait times longer and made it so that the people who were working there were just overwhelmed. Another concerning thing is that some of these conspiracies have resulted in survivors and innocent people kind of being, exposed or involved. So one of the conspiracies that was, related to all this was the Wayfair conspiracy that happened also this past summer. And for those who aren't familiar, so Wayfair is a, popular furniture store. You buy stuff online, and there's this, someone posted, I think it was on Reddit initially, it might have been on 4chan initially. They found a bunch of products that were overpriced essentially, and they used names of people in the product names on Wayfair. And somehow there's quite a few of these, and Wayfair later attributed it to a pricing glitch. But somehow people connected these products with children who were kidnapped recently. The names of these products with the names of a recently kidnapped child. For example, there'd be a cabinet that was named like Emily, and there was recently an Emily that had an Amber Alert. And they made this connection that Wayfair was abducting these children and was then posting them on their website as a piece of furniture for an inflated price, and that if you ordered that furniture project, what would be delivered to you is the child who had been missing. And in this process, so a couple of things happened. One, a lot of these tips went to the human trafficking hotline, which were explored. And two, a lot of the personal information about these victims was posted online as they were trying to kind of uncover the web of what was going on. And a lot of these victims and survivors' information became public information, and their privacy was basically invaded. So this initial like conspiracy theory was unsubstantiated, and even at the time of their posting, a lot of these victims had already been returned to their home or found, and there wasn't really any reason to believe them. But it was difficult to combat this because people wanted proof that this wasn't happening, but there's no way to give that proof other than saying some of these victims have been found. And so it was hard to convince people that this wasn't happening, but regardless, a lot of these victims, a lot of these survivors, just information was plastered all over the internet. And then finally, as something we've talked about before, is that these conspiracy theories really serve as a distractor. Over 90% of trafficked people, as well as children who are kidnapped, are taken by people that they know. And this idea that there's this grand global conspiracy with wealthy people who are picking your kids off the street just isn't a valid concern. It's taking away from the fact that the traffickers, the kidnappers, all this is happening to people in our community by people in our community. These aren't these detached, powerful people who are taking us away. And by creating these conspiracies, it makes us feel that we aren't relevant to this, but we are our saviors by talking about this. Instead, the way we need to think about it is this is happening to people in our community, and it's happening by people in our community. And unfortunately, when we think about these conspiracies, it makes us forget about the real issue that's happening. And then, as I've said, it's really hard to know what to do with these movements. There's no real consensus. Some organizations have publicly denounced these theories, while others have opted not to comment, either because they don't know or they fear retribution by members of these movements and they just don't want to deal with it. Some smaller organizations have kind of turned a blind eye, saying, these are people who are against trafficking. I don't want to deal with it too much. And unfortunately, we don't have much guidance. This issue is so new, it's so evolving. Like, the FBI isn't telling us like what this means for trafficking efforts. So it's hard to say how we should really deal with it. But ultimately, misinformation is spreading, and it's changing how people view human trafficking. And in my opinion, not for the better. It's definitely making people not understand what human trafficking really is. And it's reinforcing stereotypes that have been created and take away from how we handle this for the future. So then ultimately, kind of wrapping up, so social media has had this massive impact on every aspect, from the traffickers' perspective to the victims, and then to our, perspective as anti-trafficking movements and the spread of information. And I think the big key here is that in some ways, anti-trafficking movements are behind in using social media. Traffickers are on the cutting edge, whereas anti-trafficking movements aren't necessarily. We utilize it to some extent, but we don't utilize it to its fullest extent. And I think that's where the power in social media is really going to lie, in anti-trafficking, is finding a way to act, using these tools to come into contact with people who need resources and implementing new and novel ways to combat these issues. And at the same time, making sure that the information we spread in our communities is legitimate that we combat the misinformation that's out there, and making sure that people are just understanding the issue and combating it appropriately. And that is all I have. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask now.
Gurgis, I'd love to hear from you, because I have like a extremely dystopian opinion of these social media websites. I think especially Facebook and Twitter. Without getting too off topic, which is really easy to do with this subject, I feel like in the economic system we have, when a company gets to be as big as Facebook and Twitter, their like only true obligation is to their shareholders, and it is not in their best interest to their shareholders, which again is like their only the closest thing to a moral obligation they have, to come out and say Facebook and Twitter is now like a trafficker's best tool, and we have to actively combat that, right? That is like not convenient for them to do. And if kind of our regulatory agencies are like really behind, where do you see this going? Because like I see this just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't see that we're equipped to handle it. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think it's the thing that everyone's talking about now, right? It's how do you manage it? The internet is this weird place where it's somehow both the Wild West, but it's also not, because it's in the control of like 3 companies basically, right? And how do you deal with that? It's this balance of free speech, but this balance of moral obligations to not spread misinformation, and it's this challenge that we're fighting. We're starting to get a little off topic, but I'm sure we've all heard in the news about what's going on with Parler, and it's this huge issue because, I mean, the control is in these couple of companies. You're right, regulatory agencies are not going to be able to manage this in a timely fashion, right? These issues are present now, and our legal system isn't going to be able to manage this in the next couple of years. I don't know. I agree that there's no way this is going to really end well in the path we're going. It's either going to be, the only reason these private entities would crack down on the use of social media in things like trafficking is because the image of being a trafficking website is going to hurt them. And that's really the way to target them, because you're right, the moral obligation doesn't exist, because if it's making the money, why would they want to change that? And I think that's really the way to target it, is that recognizing that if Facebook is suddenly becoming a website where people are being sold, that makes it much less appealing for people to go on and utilize. And I think that's the way to sort of go about that. Cool. So,
Eager, thanks for like talking about this in particular. This is super interesting. Like I'm really interested in like how social media is used for human trafficking. I think social media just being so new and not having much regulation off the bat, it's definitely a place where there's a lot of moral and ethical ambiguity. Like not going too off topic too, but I know like I've watched like the documentary like Social Dilemma that really just kind of illustrates that like the job of the social media companies is trying to target like the individuals to increase user engagement, right? So they're trying to get you to use their services more and kind of put you in that bubble. So there's definitely that like Facebook algorithm that like kind of advertises posts that you want to see, and kind of puts you in that bubble too. And I know that's very prevalent, at least with the recent like political realm too. And, it's very easy to just, unfollow people that don't have your opinions and get advertisements by people who share your opinions, and you kind of get put into this bubble too. So my question for you is, I'm kind of wondering, we talked about yesterday about the demand for these products, the human trafficking, the sex trafficking products. Like, I think you may have mentioned earlier too, but do you think like in their advertising of like these trafficked persons, do you think they go out of their way to find people with these demographics that are looking for like these trafficking products, or like, is it just regular people that are just seeing these ads that they think are something else, but end up being a human trafficking ad? So how do you think they're like really navigating that algorithm to reach people that would use the services?
Yeah. You know, that's an interesting question, and I don't really have a good answer for that. But I think, you know, a lot of how social media has been implemented in the trafficking sphere is modifying existing methods to tailor them to a new platform, right? So, you know, street advertising has gone down in favor of online advertising, and street advertising is targeted in a way to, you know, show people who are already interested in a product and just direct them. And I think that's the primary way social media is being used in the, you know, advertising in the context of human trafficking. I don't necessarily think that we're necessarily finding new people are finding new people that wouldn't otherwise be interested in this as a product. With that being said, I do think the internet in general has made it easier to sort of get access to that. And I think the gray area of pornography, sex work, and human trafficking, it's just blurred so much with the internet. You go, like, you know, you'll be on someone might be on a normal, you know, a normal website, and they'll, like a normal pornographic website, then suddenly they'll be on a live show, and then suddenly they're interacting with a real person, and suddenly they're meeting with that person, where, like, I think it creates this avenue for people that otherwise wouldn't engage in you know, this type of product as in real, like a real life, rather than just a virtual type of thing, to make it easier to find.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. You know, it's definitely easy for these traffickers to kind of go covert and kind of hide and play it into the normal like sex market of, you know, pornography or, you know, strip clubs or whatever. Just kind of be covert and not actually be true with their intentions, but that kind of leads you into, you know, hey, I'm gonna, you know, check out this porn, and that leads you down, you know, a different avenue to getting something darker. So I can definitely see that being a possibility and way of going about it.
So I guess if there's no more questions, I think we're going to be taking a little bit of a break right now.
Yes, that is awesome. So we are going to take, I will say, 5-minute break. It is noon, so we are running longer than I think we had planned, but I think this is all awesome, awesome material that I wouldn't want to rush through. So I'll give everybody a 5-minute break, and we will start at 12:04.
David, I'm just seeing your slides, so that's good.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so we are at 12:04. I am going to just one more piece of logistics that I think for the rest of the session and the rest of their talks, we're just going to try to kind of push through them without long breaks in between. And if at any time somebody wants to get up and go to the bathroom or get water, like I totally invite you to do that. With that, I want to thank Gurgis one more time. That was a really, really informative and I think unique talk. And when Gurgis asked what we thought about talking about social media and specifically QAnon and conspiracy theories, I said, that is an awesome idea that is supercharged and I think it's important, but I wouldn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. So I think he did a really good job talking about it in a really informed and objective way. So with that, again, I'm David. I'm a fourth-year medical student. Those of you that have interacted with me at all know that I love talking, so I will try to be done quickly, but I'm very excited to get to share my thoughts on a very important issue. So I'm applying to pediatrics. I'm interested in pursuing a fellowship in pediatric emergency medicine and child abuse and neglect. So this ties like very directly into today's topic. So with that, I want to start with a quick kind of two definitions. What exactly is child human trafficking? So I think we've touched on this a little bit throughout the week, but child sex trafficking is any commercial sex act involving a child under the age of 18. So just to be very clear, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. So anytime there's an exchange of commercial goods for sex with a child under the age of 18, that is human trafficking. And I think an important thing to add to that is it does not need to be money. So if a child is exchanging any kind of sexual favors or sexual acts for money or drugs or a place to stay, that is all considered human trafficking. And then importantly to note, it's not just sex trafficking that happens to children, there's also labor trafficking. So child labor includes any employment below the minimum wage as established in national legislation, any hazardous unpaid household activities, and obviously any forms of slavery. And there's lots of different ways to describe it, but essentially any work by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. And that's from the US Department of Labor. So scope of the problem, I think it's helpful to talk about how common it is because especially when we talk about how important education is, and we go to school systems and say this is something we want to talk about, there are a lot of places that say, oh, well, that's not a problem here. So this is a map put out by Polaris of all of the reports of human trafficking. So as you can see, this happens in all 50 states and Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. So there is not a state in the country that can say it's not happening there. And I think I would also add that if you really are in a community where it hasn't happened yet, if such a community exists, I think with, as Gurgis so eloquently talked about, traffickers recruiting online, it is a matter of time until a trafficker approaches children in your community. It is not if, it's a matter of when. And I think we would all want our children to be prepared to like be aware of what's happening and how to say no and not fall into these traps. So these are some statistics from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In 2020, they received 17,000 reports of possible child sex trafficking. They've received reports of child sex trafficking again in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. This probably doesn't need to be said at this point, but it occurs in all types of communities, suburban, rural, urban, and tribal lands. Trends show us that, so one of the most vulnerable groups to human trafficking are children that have run away from home. And when children run away frequently or for long periods of times, trends have shown that they tend to be running from and or towards an unsafe situation. And so of the more than 26,500 cases of children reported missing in 2020, they estimate about 1 in 6 were likely victims of child sex trafficking. Okay, so that is many thousands of children every year. In 2020, boys made up about 7% of child sex trafficking victims. And again, it's not just happening to girls. This is also a problem that affects boys. And I think a lot of people think that number is underestimated because for some communities, there tends, and probably all communities, I think boys and young men and men tend to carry a lot more shame and stigma after recovering from these types of work. So it tends to go underreported even more so with males. So some more kind of depressing statistics. In the United States, the average age of entry into the commercial sex industry is 12 to 14 years of age. Again, just to emphasize, anytime this happens under the age of 18, that's human trafficking. There does not need to be force, fraud, or coercion used if it is a child. And so they got this number. They tend to survey adults working in the sex industry. And so they said, what age did you start this work? And the average is 12 to 14. So again, I think when we talk about sex work versus human trafficking, it's important to remember that even if a person is choosing to participate as an adult or young adult, that does not mean they started at an age where consent could even possibly be given. So again, the average age to start this is 12 to 14. So I think another thing that scares me is within 48 hours of running away, a teenager is likely to be approached for commercial sexual exploitation. And this is from the Department of Health and Human Services. So within 2 days, a child is likely to be at least approached to be exploited in this way. And so sometimes it is approached by, a pimp or a trafficker to be a part of their operation. More often for runaways, it is a child being approached and someone coming to them and saying, well, I'll give you a place to stay, but you have to, provide some kind of sexual favor. And this is a number, this last one, number that terrifies me. So the number varies depending on what survey you ask, but they're all about the same. And surveys have shown that up to 81% of patients referred for domestic minor sex trafficking, so child sex trafficking, had been seen by a medical provider at least once within the last year. So we know that this is a huge industry, millions of dollars. We know that this is happening to thousands of children every year. And we know that these children are seeing us, and we know that we are totally missing the ball. These children are in our offices, they're in our clinics, they're in our emergency departments. 8 out of 10, that's 4 out of 5 kids see us and we don't do anything. So I think there is a lot to be said in the value of education and prevention, and that, it's not necessarily helpful to focus all of our efforts on catching children once they've been trafficked, not catching, but recognizing children once they've been trafficked, as opposed to keeping them from getting trafficked in the first place. But this is like a number that makes me sick to my stomach. 4 out of 5 are seeing us and we are missing it. So a ton of work to be done in that area. So one of the things we talk about is vulnerable populations, who is most vulnerable. And I think this is a really helpful video. And as usual, survivors kind of say it best. So I'm going to let them speak.
Any child is vulnerable, right? Just by the nature of being a child or young teenager or older teenager, you're vulnerable. But any extra factors that you throw in is going to make you more vulnerable. It wasn't just him painting this glamorous life that I could be a part of if I ran away. It was also that things were happening at home and in my community that made me want to run away. It was those two things together. And I think it's kids who are experiencing those two things, something that they want to get away from and this other thing that they would like to gravitate towards.
I was a runner. I loved running away because I felt that if I stayed, those bad things would happen again. So I continued to run.
Oftentimes we're in situations that are not of choice or something that we want to be in. And so the lack of, there's no Amber Alert for foster children when they go missing. There's no posters, there's no flyers, there's no PSA about missing foster children. We go missing and nobody cares. We go missing and there's no alerts put out. And this is something that the exploiters really capitalize on. They know this. They know that for foster children, there's not going to be anybody looking for us. When you're so unstable and you lack attachments, you really want as a young person to attach to someone and something, which makes you vulnerable to attach to people that are not so good.
I was just a naive kid. You didn't have to tell me much. You could just tell me I was beautiful and I would believe you at that moment in my life. And for me, it didn't feel that bad because I had already been sexually abused. I had already been touched against my will. I had already been raped. I had already went through a series of different experiences that took away any, I want to say, it took away all of my innocence.
I was a teenager. The only person that was close to me my entire life was murdered. I had been through a million, so many different placements, and I was lost. I was lost and I needed love.
So I was really angry. I was acting out. I really needed some guidance, and I really needed someone to reach out to me and offer me some help. But I didn't know how to ask for that help. And I think that the people around me didn't know exactly how to offer that help. So in the end, it was someone who was looking to prey on a child or a teenager who reached out and offered help that looked tangible to me, that I responded to.
My hope is to live in a world where children are protected, no matter what their background is, that someone cares for them, even if you didn't give birth to them. Even if it's a child walking down the street, you care about that child. If you see them in need, help them. That's my hope, to live in a world where we protect our children.
So that kind of speaks for itself. I couldn't have said any of that any better. But there are two things I want to highlight because that was a lot to process. So one thing I think that I really connect with, or I really like, resonates with me, is that all children are vulnerable. So I think we talk a whole lot about what children are most vulnerable. And you can see this table here kind of highlights all of these various different groups, but all children are vulnerable. So, when I think about everybody, even if you come from like a great family with a great parents and all these great things, like a lot of us, I said this the other day, a lot of us have made like romantic choices that we look back on and we're like, oh, that wasn't so smart. And our parents were probably like holding their breaths for this to resolve. And that is not an unusual part of a teenage experience, right? So all it takes is for someone to take advantage of that. So certainly some groups are more vulnerable than others, but it is not like you have to come from a broken home or a poor low income home for this to happen. Like this really has its tentacles in like all aspects of society. And then I think all of that being said, the other thing they really highlighted was that you really need to, for this to, the perfect recipe for this, that traffickers are really, they're very good at their job. They're really good at picking out the children that are most vulnerable, that are so desperate to get out of their home or their situation that, somebody comes and says, well, I've got this better option for you. Like, that's all it takes. Like, it's not a hard sell. So they highlighted the foster care situation. And I just want to share like a quick story. First of all, I had no idea Amber Alerts aren't issued for missing foster children. And when I heard that, I was like, is that really true? And it is true, which blows my mind. Anyway, so last year I helped help take care of a child who grew up in an abusive home, was sexually abused, was taken out of that home and placed into foster care. That was going as well as it could. I think for foster care, it was almost an ideal situation. The family cared deeply for this child. They were adjusting, I think, as well as they could given the circumstances. But then this child sexually abused their foster siblings, which is unfortunately not that uncommon. So they came from a family where, that is how they showed each other love. Like this was normal, appropriate behavior in this child's mind. Now you have a family full of abused children and traumatized children. So this family, I think understandably, had to be removed from that home. And while they were awaiting new placement, they were kind of in between foster families. they were like so overcome with grief and shame and guilt and anger and all of these terrible emotions that I can't begin to pretend I understand. They attempted to commit suicide, and that is how they came into our care at the VTCC. And so when you think about a child like that, okay, just how miserable their life has been, and you have someone that comes and appears to be trustworthy, maybe for the first time in their life, and says, hey, you know, I'm sorry this happened to you. I think you're a beautiful person. I'm going to give you a better life. Like, how easy is it to take that option? It's way better than what I'm offering them, a hospital stay followed by a placement into another foster home. And, you know, that has not gone well for them. So I think those, especially foster care involved youth, are especially vulnerable to these things. Oh, yep. So how does this happen? So I'm not going to belabor these points because a lot of this was covered by Gurgis, but a lot of us, I think, have this idea in our head of kidnapping. And while there are certainly exceptions, the norm is online recruitment and grooming. Overwhelmingly, the child kind of gets to know you, they're groomed, they build a lot of trust, and kind of, it's not all of a sudden they take you, you slowly build up to this. Again, child sex trafficking victims virtually always know their traffickers, and sex traffickers usually groom or seduce children into commercial sex. Rarely do they kidnap them. And so one point I also want to add, and I think this is really sad, but we've heard about it already this week, is sometimes it's a family member. So it's not even someone you meet online. This can sometimes be an aunt or an uncle, or I have seen cases where it is the parent. And that is obviously heartbreaking. And again, child sex trafficking tends to happen with kind of online grooming. Not that children should be getting into vans with strangers for candy, but that is not usually how this happens. And then I took this slide from a lecture I had with Dr. Foster, and just kind of summarizes different things. So it can come in the way of a job offer. So children can be told, like, you'd be a great model, come to this hotel for this photo shoot. Or an actress, you know, like, I want to be your agent, come, you know, here's our first gig. Or a dancer. Obviously, internet, I'm not going to go too much into that because Gurgis covered that very well. Offered drugs or alcohol, intimate partner. So it's not unusual for this to begin as under the guise of, I'm going to be your boyfriend. And we have heard about cases where, you know, they were your boyfriend and then they said, well, I want money to buy you a house, and this is how we're going to get money to buy you this house. So seduction then becomes coercion. So some warning signs. So this is geared more towards medical providers. Not everyone here is a medical provider. I totally understand that. Whoops. But some physical indicators. So signs of sexual or physical abuse, signs of neglect, unaddressed, especially chronic medical or dental issues or STIs. A close association with an overly controlling adult, especially if it is an adult that you don't understand why they're so controlling. Like, some parents are controlling and you have to kind of navigate that, but you really get concerned if it's someone that it doesn't even pretend to be the parent that's very controlling. Anytime you come into the care of a child because they were found, or they tell you they're living at a hotel, a street track, they're involved in strip clubs, like, these are all like red flags that need to get you to ask more questions. If you find out that they have some kind of a secret phone or apps that provide multiple cell phone numbers, if they come into possession of items that are inconsistent with the child's access to money or socioeconomic status. So if you're dealing with a very low income family and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a child starts coming in very nice clothes and very nice shoes, you should ask questions of like, hey, that's really nice. Where'd you get, that looks nice. How'd you get that? Or that's really cool. Where did you get that from? And, you know, we want to encourage kids to be entrepreneurial and, you know, if it's the appropriate age to get a job, and those are all good things we want to encourage, but you want an explanation of like, how were you able to come into possession of these things all of a sudden? Again, living out of suitcases, motels, or any other evidence of housing insecurity. If a child or teenager is in possession of bulk sexual paraphernalia, such as condoms or lubricants. So I personally really encourage teenagers to have access to condoms and those things of that nature and family planning. However, if they are all of a sudden they've got 100 condoms, that is not normal or helpful. And you need to ask, like, how'd you get those? Like, what do you need that many for? Tattoos or branding, such as those indicating money or matching other known trafficking victims, or that the child is reluctant to explain. We know that often they get their trafficker's initials tattooed on them. If they start talking about how they've traveled to other cities or states in a period that you know that they were missing or where nobody knew where they were, that should be very concerning. And frequent abuse of party drugs, such as some of these listed. And then I know that not everyone here is a medical provider. So I think especially for educators and social workers, some behavioral indicators are really helpful. These are kinds of things that should raise your concern. So if a child is like constantly running away from home, especially 3 or more times, if there's unexplained absences from school, if they're constantly asleep during class, if they stop doing things they used to really love doing, if all of a sudden they stop communicating with friends and family, if they're overly frightened, annoyed, resistant, or belligerent, especially to authority figures, if they avoid answering your questions or let others speak for them, that's like pretty unusual for a teenager. They usually have a lot to say. If they lie about their age or identity or have a secret online profile, if they're using language or emojis that's often associated with commercial sex work, such as Trick, The Life, or The Game, and if they're referencing online escort ads, that is always concerning. Dating websites and apps, I mean, it's like an, I think, unfortunate, really uncomfortable truth that lots of 16-year-olds are on some of these dating apps, and that doesn't necessarily need to make you concerned about human trafficking, but if they're on them at an age where that really doesn't seem appropriate, then that should really be concerning. And I think talking about, how to be safe on them is appropriate at any age. It's hard for some of these. Some of this is normal teenage behavior, sleeping during class, skipping class, belligerent to authority figures. Like this describes a lot of teenagers. So I think one, noticing when it's becoming problematic or frequent, noticing when it's really out of character for a child. So previously they were really well behaved and now all of a sudden they've become belligerent towards authority. And I just want to add that it's never a problem to ask. Like no one is ever going to fault you for coming to a kid and saying, hey, I've noticed you're sleeping a lot. Like, can you tell me what's going on? That's never going to be a problem. And even if you ask that question, a child's being trafficked, they don't tell it to you this time. They now know that there's an adult that noticed them, noticed that they exist and asks, how are you doing? And that alone can make a big difference. So some management concerns, so things specifically related to caring for these children in a medical setting. So the priority in medical management, like as with any emergency department patient, is to address any acute, emergent, surgical, or life-threatening issues such as hemorrhage, trauma, or severe infection. You also need to remember that a lot of these kids have not seen a doctor for years, if ever. So chronic health issues like diabetes that maybe you wouldn't expect to look for can be totally uncontrolled and may require aggressive treatment or inpatient admission. In cases where sexual assault is suspected, which is going to be most of these cases, you want to follow the institutional guidelines wherever you are for sexual assault kind of evidence collecting kits or rape kits. You need to consider rape kits if local law enforcement thinks they're going to be helpful in persecuting the perpetrators. The thing that is hard is that these are mostly geared towards like sexual assault or rape, like one-time events, and their use in the prosecution of human trafficking cases has not been studied. It's really unclear. And if you've never seen these been done, it is like a long process. I mean, it takes hours to go through the rape kit. There's pictures involved. I mean, it's a really traumatic experience. So it's not something you want to do unless you think you like feel confident it's going to aid in the prosecution of the perpetrator, which is really the point of the rape kit. So female patients should be tested for pregnancy. You want to test for sexually transmitted diseases, including gonorrhea, chlamydia, HIV, syphilis, and hepatitis. You might want to consider urine toxicology, especially if the patient is presenting with symptoms of acute intoxication or withdrawal. You want to consider tuberculosis testing, especially for victims that have been trafficked from outside of the United States. I say all of these things, some of them seem really obvious, but when you are kind of acutely caring for them, I think it's really easy, especially when you're trying to remember all of the components of trauma-informed care, to forget all of the auxiliary tests that you need to do outside of immediate safety. And so a female needs to have a pregnancy test done if they consent to that. And if pregnancy test is negative, pregnancy prophylaxis, things like Plan B, can offer for up to 120 hours after the last sexual activity. HIV prophylaxis may be offered to victims who have had sex within the last 48 hours. Prevalence of HIV ranges from 40 up to 90%, depending on what survey you're looking at, in sex trafficking victims who have been subject to unprotected sex with multiple partners. And they also may be forced into unsafe use of injectable drugs. You also want to consider hepatitis B prophylaxis if the patient has not been immunized for that already, or if the immunization status is unknown, which it will often be. And patients with urine tests that are positive for drugs of abuse may require inpatient treatment for detox or initiation of medical treatment. And then this is something I totally would not have thought of if I hadn't been reading about it, is you want to consider tetanus toxoid or tetanus vaccine for any IV drug users or people that have been forced into IV drug use, as well as any trafficking victim with abrasions or lacerations. It's going to be really hard to know what caused those abrasions. And then you also want to do a comprehensive mental health screening. These children are going to be dealing with trauma that I can't begin to imagine. Some issues or things to remember with safety planning. So one of the things that comes up a lot in the literature on this issue is the importance of specifying human trafficking and not child abuse or sexual abuse. And when they go through educational tools with emergency medicine providers and pediatric emergency departments, one of the things they harp on time and time again is you need to make sure that we're classifying this as human trafficking. And this is one of the big failures, that even if a provider catches it, they often classify it as child abuse or sexual abuse. And the reason this matters, because my initial thought was, well, that seems like an unimportant detail. Why are we picking on that? The reason that this matters is it changes where the child goes. So oftentimes with child abuse or sexual abuse, they go to a psychiatric care facility. Sometimes they don't even go to a psychiatric care facility. And these children pose an especially high, I don't like using the word flight risk, but they're extremely likely to run away. They've often been running away. They're often extremely trusting of their trafficker. And it's many, as we've talked about, years-long process to kind of untie all of these things. So you really need, if at all possible, to send them to a place that specifically deals with child sex trafficking victims. And if you don't classify it as such, they're not going to get that care. And sometimes, I know from Dr. Foster, some of her stories, that they have gone through immense trouble to get children connected with facilities that specifically care for child sexual assault or child sex trafficking victims, and the child still manages to get out and run away and return to the trafficker. So you want to give the child basically a fighting chance by getting them to the appropriate place that is best able to deal with them. And the human trafficking hotline, it's worth noting, not just for patients or victims, but also providers. So if you are not lucky enough to be at a place like VCU that sees some of these things and has social workers that are well versed in this, and you have this patient in your ED and you're the attending and you're I have no idea what to do with this kid and I don't know where to send them, you can call this hotline and they are very well connected and they will be able to tell you, what is the best option. I think this is another area where we're really behind in setting up all these resources for these kids, but they will be able to tell you what is the best option. So something to keep in mind. So for adult patients with children, so I feel like I won the lottery in that I got the best child or the best patient population ever in children, and I'm going to get to take care of children. But not everybody wins the lottery and not everybody gets to be a pediatrician. So for those of us not seeing children, these are some things pediatricians would hope that you ask. If you have an adult patient that you find is being trafficked, And at some point they disclose, or you find out, or they mention, I have a child. So things we would hope that you ask. So the important thing, the reason you ask any of these questions at all is safety. You want to make sure that the child is safe. And it is helpful to start with that, if it's okay with you, I'd love to ask some questions because I want to make sure your child is safe. And usually, I mean, not always, but usually parents, no matter the situation, also want their child to be safe. So if you start with that, you're not asking because you want to get anyone in trouble. You're not asking because you're like a detective, but I want to make sure your child is safe, just like you want to make sure your child is safe. I also think it's helpful to start, as we should in all of our sensitive conversations, with limits of confidentiality and what you would have to report. And just so, again, you don't ever want, especially a victim of human trafficking, to feel like you tricked them into telling you something. So telling them that I want to just make sure your child is safe. These are kind of, if I feel like your child is unsafe, there are some things I might need to disclose, and then you kind of start the conversation. So you want to ensure that basic needs are provided for. So things like clothing, are you able to get a coat in the winter for your child? Are you able to get food consistently for your child? And these are things that if they're struggling with, it's not necessarily a CPS report, but it can be connecting them with resources if that's something they feel that they can safely access, a clothing bank or a food bank. So when was the last time your child saw a doctor? Are they up to date on their shots? Those types of things. You want to make sure that their child is able to access medical care. And then in line with keeping the kid safe, who is watching the kid? I don't know if while you're at work is the best way to say it, but while you're doing what it is that you do, where is your child and who's watching them? And this is important because sometimes I've learned that one of the ways that traffickers entice young women with children into these things is by saying, I will provide you with childcare. Okay. And obviously, a human trafficker watching your child is like not an ideal or safe situation. But oftentimes you'll find that you'll chat with these patients and, I leave them with my neighbor who I trust and they're doing fine. And so that's to say that not everyone who's being human trafficked is unable to raise a child. Okay. So they, if they're providing all these basic needs and their child is safe and taken care of, then there is no need to really do anything for the safety of the child. And again, that comes back to you're asking because you want to make sure the child is safe. And that is like your only agenda in asking these things. One thing I want to add is you want to be on the lookout for any discrepancies between a parent's socioeconomic status and a parent needs. So what I mean by that is, especially if you're engaged in working with under-resourced, underserved communities, it is not uncommon, it might be the norm, that families struggle to provide food and clothing for children. And that does not mean that they're being neglected. That means these are families that need to be connected with appropriate resources. That being said, if you have a family that comes in and the parents are very well dressed and they drive a nice car and they seem to have a lot of money, and then they tell you, oh yeah, I don't always get dinner on the table, or I haven't bought a winter coat in my child for 10 years. That needs to be concerning because that's not an issue of not being able to address the needs. That is an issue of neglect. And so Dr. Foster told me a story that they had a child here who presented to the emergency department with a femur fracture that was about a month old. And the parents were very, very, very well dressed and drove a very nice car. And one of the questions that was asked was, what happened that this took a month to get to the emergency department? A femur fracture is like not something that happens by a simple fall, which I think was the explanation they gave, although I'm not sure about that. But the history didn't quite match the injury. And so they said, well, I have a cousin or some family member that's an orthopedic surgeon in Seattle, and I called them and they said I didn't need to take them in. And so none of this was making sense to Dr. Foster. So she filed a CPS report, and it turns out that the mother was being trafficked by this was not the patient's father, but that was who was posing as the patient's father. So this patient was being trafficked, and she really did have a relative in Seattle that was an orthopedic surgeon, and CPS called them and said, I haven't heard from them about this at all. I have no idea what this is about. So she had not called because no orthopedic surgeon would suggest waiting a month for something like this. And so this was a case where I think what really grabbed the team's attention was this is a family that appears to have all of the means to provide for this child, but does not seem to be doing that. So that should always kind of raise your concern. And as a medical provider, if you ever in any way suspect that a child is being trafficked, I hope it goes without saying that you are a mandated reporter and you have to report that. All right, so I would love to end on like a little bit of a more positive note, because this was a lot of negative things. So what are we able to do? This is a big, big, scary, overwhelming problem that we are way behind on. But by being way behind, that also means there's a lot that can be done. So I think there is a ton that we need to do in the way of education and prevention. I think something I heard yesterday was so shocking that I feel like I want to share now, is that I do think we want to try to focus on treating this as a public health issue and not always a criminal justice issue. But when the speaker yesterday said that, people that are kind of caught using human trafficking as customers, that's a misdemeanor fine. That is crazy to me. So I think criminal justice should be involved and needs to be a part of our education and prevention action. I think it's shameful that that is our system, and we have a lot of work to be done there. But in ways of education, I think as medical providers, we need to be way better at catching these things than we are. That number that 80% of children that are being trafficked have seen us and we don't do anything should really scare all of us, especially those of us working with children. So making sure we take the time to educate ourselves is an excellent place to start. I think one of the things that have come up, especially in like smaller group discussions, is how do I approach the subject? This is not really something, it's not helpful or productive or comfortable or effective to go, are you being trafficked? So these are a set of questions from the Department of Health and Human Services that kind of hopefully will lead you to uncovering human trafficking if it's happening. Some of these are geared more towards adults. So kind of use your discrepancy, but these are helpful ways to approach that conversation. I think working with children, one of our speakers this week is we're pushing really hard to get mandatory training for all children in our state. And I think that should not be a point of debate. That's like such a no-brainer. I think especially as these operations have moved online, like it's not if, it is when your child will be approached. And making sure that they know what it looks like and how to avoid it, I think is really important. And lastly, because Gurgis did such a good job talking so much about how social media plays a role, some ways to safety plan for your child that's on social media. So this is from American Academy of Pediatricians. The website is right here. It's really cool. So as you may be able to tell, I have a very low opinion of social media, especially for children. I think it's a bad thing. But we also live in the year 2020 and children are on social media. And to tell your child not to use social media is to tell your child not to have any friends, which is not a good approach either. So I think finding ways to teach your child to be safe. And these are some great places to start. They have a whole interactive tool if you go to this website where it's like a social media plan for the family, and they talk about screen-free zones in the home and guidelines for screen use. And it's not just about safety planning. This is one section of that tool. And I just thought that was really cool because especially if you aren't someone that is 14 that has grown up with this since they were talking, this is so overwhelming. How am I supposed to navigate this with my child? I do not envy parents that have been tasked with this. So I think this is a helpful tool. So with that, I would love to get into any questions people might have.
So David, along the lines of your last slide, admittedly, one of my friends was a lawyer, but he actually had his kids, when he finally gave them their first phone, sign a contract. And if they didn't follow all of the lines of the contract said he could take away the phone. So just something to think about.
I think one of the really interesting pieces of advice I've seen is, so I think the average screen time use now is about 6 hours. And when you consider that oftentimes children are sitting watching the TV on their phone, kind of looking at or on the computer, looking at their phone, that's like 18 hours, which also means that if the average is 6, there are children that are getting 24 hours of screen time a day. If you talk to most children, most of them do not want 24 hours of screen time a day. Like, I don't think this applies to myself as well. I spend way more time on screens than I intend to. So I think if you approach a child up front and say, how many hours a day do you think you want to be spending on the screen? Most kids, I mean, not always, but most kids will give a reasonable answer. I mean, even children don't want to be spending 20 hours a day on the screen. So then you get that agreement. You say, okay, well, now I'm going to hold you to it. And I think that's much, especially with a teenager, much more like a practical way to do this than saying, okay, well, I'm going to say that you can't use it more than 4 hours a day. And then I'm going to try, like, there's no way to police that. I think as we use social media on our phones, there's no effective way to enforce that anyway. So I think kind of involving them, I think I was very surprised to hear that children are reasonable with setting guidelines, but that is what most people say. So I think that was interesting. Okay, with that, unless anybody else has any questions, I am going to kind of hand it over to Carrie. And real quick, before I let her get started, I just want to thank her one more time. I'd like to think Gurgis and Ben and I have been at least a little helpful, but I think it's really obvious that Carrie has been kind of running the show and dealing with all the tech stuff. So a big thank you to her.
Thanks, David. You do have a couple questions in the chat that I can read to you. So from Faye, can you confirm that CHOR has a child trafficking protocol in place? Has the human trafficking protocol for adults been rolled out yet? Ethically, we shouldn't be screening without a protocol in place.
Oh, that's a really good question that I do not know the answer to. I don't know if we have a protocol in place, but I would love to find out and get back to you.
And then a question from Bobby. I know you want to educate children on social media / dating apps safety in a preventative sense, but in pediatrics, would it be helpful for providers to have this talk with parents? Is this currently being done for teenage well visits? How can pediatricians involve parents in this important discussion?
Yeah, that is an awesome question. So I do think as children become more kind of autonomous with device use, involving them in the conversation is increasingly important, because if we are honest with ourselves, parents have very little control over what kids end up actually doing on social media. They have a lot of power in educating children on how to be safe and hopefully teaching them the skills and tools to use these things well. But I mean, I think the days where you could turn the TV off because the TV limit is up, like, that's gone. Children are going to use their phone, and it's really hard to stop that. So I do think it's important to involve children. I think it's equally important to involve parents. I also think they're not just with social media, but like parents tend to feel like oh, my hands I can't deal with this. Like, this is too much, and I don't know how to manage it. And that is also, I feel like, a disservice to your child to just kind of say, oh, I can't deal with this. This is too complicated, or I don't understand it. So I think it's important for them to be involved. I do think in an ideal world, we address this at every well child check from before children start using screens. I have seen some places in their EMRs, they ask about screen time at every well. That's one of the questions that kind of pops up to ask. AAP certainly recommends asking about it at every well child check. In reality, this does not happen always. But I think as we learn more and more about social media use, this is such a bigger problem than just human trafficking. I mean, this affects all children that are otherwise very healthy. So I do think pediatricians, I hope in the coming years, we're going to get more active in this area. But yeah, I do think approaching this conversation with children and parents at every well visit from before they start using social media is helpful. And you asked how to approach that conversation. I think it's helpful if you do it before they're on social media, because at a certain point, like, the cat's out of the bag. They're on social media. They've now learned how they want to use it. And to kind of pull it back is way, way harder than to teach them about, these are the boundaries and guidelines that I want you to respect before they get on.
Great. And I would say parents also need to be role models for that, because I think a lot of parents use too much social media as well. Any other questions for David before we move into my presentation? Okay, thanks, David. That was great. So I will share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to speak briefly today about human trafficking education for emergency department or ED providers. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Carrie Shadwin. I'm a fourth-year medical student here at VCU. I'm applying into OBGYN. So I would argue with David that I actually get the best patient population, but personal preference, and Dr. Rigby says she agrees. I also just want to thank Faye and the whole team for just putting on an awesome symposium this week. I think I'm really going to hopefully carry a lot of the lessons that we discussed this week into practice when we start actually being doctors in a couple months. So it's very exciting. So objectives for my talk today: discuss health consequences of human trafficking, which David also touched upon, describe importance of ED as point of contact for trafficked persons with the healthcare system, discuss deficit in awareness and education of ED providers regarding human trafficking, describe educational interventions that have been implemented to target this deficit, and discuss recommendations for future educational tools. But first, a little bit about my interest in this topic. So my interest in human trafficking effort or anti-trafficking efforts started way back when I was in undergrad at Berkeley out in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was lucky enough to be part of an organization called Soccer Without Borders. And with their work, they provide soccer teams for under-resourced youth in a bunch of cities in the US and then also abroad. And I worked on a team with about 15 or 20 young girls in Oakland, California, most of whom were refugees, so brought into the country or they fled their home country, or immigrants. And because I worked on the administration side as well a little bit, I knew a little bit about some of their stories, and several of the girls that I coached had been victims of trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking in their home countries. And I think that this experience was meaningful for me both at the time, just being able to get to hang out with the girls and have a lot of fun with them and teach them some of my soccer skills. But then also I think it really informed the work that I hope to do as a physician and as an OBGYN, just helping girls, especially who have survived really intense experiences and traumatic experiences, bridge from girlhood to womanhood and all of the complications and exciting things that come along with that. So some of my favorite memories with these girls actually were, most of them didn't have transportation to the soccer field. And so I would just scoop them up in my car on my way to practice. And I vividly remember them sitting a few of them sitting in the back seat, like belting out Bieber lyrics in very heavily accented English. And it was just a really fun time for them to just get to be kids, because that's what they are, despite everything that they had been through. So a little bit about our project. So because of my work with Faye, I get a lot of emails from different stakeholders in Virginia on anti-trafficking efforts, which is great. And we got this call for papers in probably September about anti-trafficking education literature. And so I teamed up with one of our second-year medical students who hopefully will be leading the charge in the future, Sarah, and then also Dr. Rigby was great as a faculty mentor to create this project, Human Trafficking Education for Healthcare Providers in the ED. So we submitted to Anti-Trafficking Review. We haven't heard back yet. They haven't announced which papers they're going to publish. But we will be presenting this. We submitted an abstract to this conference, and we'll be presenting this in February. So our research question was, what educational interventions have been implemented in the emergency department around the US to educate ED personnel on the issue of human trafficking? So why healthcare? As David kind of alluded to, and as we've talked about all week, there's a ton of all kinds of effects of being trafficked, and so the healthcare impacts are some of the longest lasting and also some of the most life-threatening. So there are physical impacts of trafficking from fractures, abrasions, toxic exposures, both on the labor trafficking and sex trafficking side. There are sexual impacts, frequent STIs, HIV, unwanted pregnancies, attempted terminations, and their subsequent infections and other fertility issues. And then there's psychological impacts of tons of PTSD, depression, self-harm, suicide, dysfunction, not being able to function as we would think a normal person should be able to function. And why the emergency department? So we focused on the ED because most trafficked persons, as David also discussed, interact with healthcare at some point while they're being trafficked. The most frequent place of contact is the emergency department. So that's for a variety of reasons. First of all, I think a lot of these people are uninsured or underinsured, or somehow don't have the proper insurance to see a primary care doctor. I think a lot of times people are also taken from place to place, so they don't have time to establish care with a primary care doctor. And then I think the emergency department is also sometimes considered less threatening. So traffickers will be okay bringing their trafficked person to the ED and not other healthcare settings. So the ED is a real window of opportunity to engage these patients, both for their acute issues and then get some of their more chronic problems as well, getting them hooked into services, both on the social services side and then on the healthcare side. But sadly, the emergency department kind of has, just like all of healthcare really, has demonstrated that they're not properly educated about the issue. I know for our medical education, I don't think we've gotten a ton of formal education on trafficking. I know Dr. Rigby and Faye and Cheryl are doing a great job of trying to target that and give more information, which is great. But I think most medical schools, both in the US and abroad, don't address this topic in as robust a way as we would hope. So the methods for our project, we use the PRISMA scoping review guidelines for conducting our review. I was really lucky to work with John Cyrus, who's one of the academic research librarians, who introduced me to a bunch of different databases that I had no idea existed. And we searched for literature that way. We were specifically looking for papers that discussed a specific educational intervention aimed to educate ED providers or ED personnel on the issue of human trafficking. So all of those searches yielded 493 publications, and then Sarah and I worked together to review those, and then we ended up with 7 articles that had a unique intervention. So results from our study, 6 out of the 7 studies implemented their educational tool in vivo, so in the actual emergency department. So these were implemented at grand rounds presentations for the emergency department personnel. These were implemented at monthly department meetings. They were also implemented at sign out, just a myriad different ways. And they were implemented in emergency departments that had an annual patient census of between 41,000 to 170,000 patients. One study was implemented at an annual ED conference. So it was given to residents and physicians, resident and attending physicians who attended that conference. 6 out of the 7 studies included a post-intervention survey, so asking questions about how the educational tool impacted provider confidence in identifying trafficked persons and their ability to get them with the appropriate resources. And then 5 out of the 7 studies also included a pre-intervention survey. Only one study actually looked at patient outcomes. So they specifically looked at if more patients were identified before and after the tool was implemented. And all 6 studies that did include a survey for the participants demonstrated an overall lack of knowledge about human trafficking prior to the tool, and an overall lack of confidence in both identifying and providing resources for this population. So in our discussion, we focused on the overall lack of evidence. I mean, the fact that we only found 7 educational tools targeted to this really important provider population demonstrates that there's a deficit in the literature. There's no evidence of any one particular approach being superior. All of the tools were, I think, under an hour to complete. And so they really allowed for the fast pace of the emergency department and the little time that people have to really share resources. People of minority groups are more likely to use the ED for healthcare because of lack of access, because of systemic racism in healthcare. And a lot of these minority groups are also sometimes more targeted by traffickers and more often impacted. So again, highlighting the importance of the ED as a place for intervention. This is a place to address both acute and chronic health problems, because a lot of, as I think Bella Hunake alluded to during her talk earlier in the week, these problems, even if you get out of the trafficking situation, the healthcare problems follow. So it's important to address those and get people into care. Also, we found that interventions are trying to move away from this goal of rescue or getting patients to disclose, and more towards universal education for patients, violence prevention, and just general harm reduction. And I'll use VCU as an example because I just had surgery at VCU a few months ago, and at every visit, even my post-op visit, I'm asked, do you feel safe at home? And I think that's a good way of normalizing that question. I know that question doesn't fully encompass the issue, but it would at least give somebody pause, perhaps, if they were experiencing an unsafe situation. Also, the interventions that seemed to be most effective were team-based. So they included attending physicians, resident physicians, learners in the emergency department, nurse practitioners, PAs, nurses, social workers, environmental services, front desk staff, because again, everybody comes from a different vantage point and identifies unique aspects of a patient and can share that information with the rest of the team in order to identify high-risk patients. That we need to really include and incorporate this type of education and awareness in medical training as well. And that community partners are really important. Several of the interventions included police officers, lawmakers, lawyers, and community social workers in developing the tool. And I think that that's really important because it's not just a medical issue. You know, this is a social work problem. This is a policy and a criminal justice issue as well. So we need to be team-based, both in the microcosm of the ED and then also in the larger community. And then we also need to be survivor-led. So these educational interventions need to have survivor team members who are willing to give advice on what to include and how to word things and how to assess for efficacy throughout the intervention. And that we need to really allow for accommodation of higher risk groups and higher risk groups who may not have as much trust in their healthcare providers and who may be less interested in disclosing what they're going through because of, you know, historic mistrust of the healthcare system. And I know Ben's going to talk next about LGBTQ youth, and I think that that's an important piece to this as well, incorporating anybody who may not feel as comfortable talking to their provider. So take-home points from our study: we need to be team-based. We need self-reported outcomes for participants. We need to be patient-centered and survivor-centered. We need to accommodate the timing and the physical constraints of the ED. So I think the ED is awesome because of the team-based nature and how it's just a web of different professionals all providing care for individuals. But that can also lead to, miscommunication and not having a lot of time during sign off. So we need to be sure that we're adjusting for those things. And I think a great way to do that is to have the ED providers advise on when would be the best time to incorporate this and how to best include all team members. And more research is needed. So these are some resources, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and just want to say thanks again, everybody, for just an awesome week.
So Carrie, one of the things you mentioned is kind of dealing with the time and physical constraints of the ED. And I feel like there are a million things we'd love to implement in the ED that are also being kind of not done because of time and physical constraints. I'd love to hear kind of what you think is either like the biggest constraint or kind of where you see this fitting in, if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it's a great question. Because I'm not an ED provider, I can't say for sure, but after having spent some time in the ED from rotations, I think that I would think that an intervention that includes multiple modalities and is very flexible with how it gets implemented would probably be best. So a few of the interventions used both an online portal where people could do it like on their break or, right before they go home, or if they have downtime. They also include an in-person training in case people prefer that. And then they also include some of them like a binder with resources at the nurses station, just so that people can flip through it. I think that you're totally right that there's so many different things that we want to do in the emergency department. And I feel like it needs to come from department leadership to say that this is something that we are going to specifically focus on for the next 3 months or the next 6 months in order to really make it a priority. And in doing that, they can say, here are the different ways you can ingest this information, and we've made it as accessible as we possibly can. It's still not going to reach everybody, but I think that helps. Awesome. Thank you all for listening so attentively. I really appreciate it. We're going to turn it over to Ben for our last presentation. Again, if you guys need to take a bathroom break or anything, please feel free to do so while Ben gets set up.
Are we ready to go? Okay, so thank you all for sticking it out for our last presentation of the day and the last presentation of the symposium. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Blake, and I'm a 4th year medical student here at VCU. I'm applying into internal medicine residency, and I have a particular interest in health equity. So today I wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning speaking about LGBTQ+ individuals in human trafficking. And throughout the week, we've mentioned that LGBT individuals are at higher risk for human trafficking, so I wanted to briefly add some additional context to that. While trafficking of LGBT individuals occurs across the world, in every area that human trafficking occurs, I'm focusing primarily domestically in the US. So first and foremost, I wanted to start off by reviewing some of the major risk factors for all cases of human trafficking. These are the common vulnerabilities that are exploited by traffickers. So beginning with homelessness or an unstable home and family dynamics, this is often cited as a major risk factor for human trafficking. Other important risk factors include substance use, recent relocation or immigration, prior trauma, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, people without legal documentation, mental illness or psychiatric disease, economic hardships, foster care, being in the child welfare system, and then belonging to a marginalized group, which can include people of color, LGBT, individuals, migrant workers, refugees. And so when thinking about the risk factors as it pertains to LGBT individuals, it really is multiple risk factors strewn together. So I created this more of as a web where they interact with each other, because this really is a complex relationship where one risk factor influences the other. LGBT individuals face discrimination and rejection in many facets of their lives. They're more likely to be affected by mental illness and substance use. They're also more likely than their non-LGBT counterparts to have prior trauma. And lastly, they face homelessness at a higher rate than the non-LGBT population. So these are a few cases from the William and Mary Law School Repository Study done in 2015, looking at homeless youth in New York who ultimately ended up exchanging sex for necessities. So this just gives you an idea of some of the many risk factors and vulnerabilities that were exploited. So I'll just give you all a few moments to read through. And as you can see in these two examples that were provided, these were interview data that was collected by this study. And it really highlights some of the risk factors and why these individuals were vulnerable to being approached and entering into exchanging sex for various necessities like food, shelter. And so moving to the next, I wanted to begin by talking about homelessness, as this is one of the major vulnerabilities exploited by traffickers. People without a home often have economic hardships and lack social support, which also adds an additional layer that can be exploited. This is also an area where there's more research as far as LGBT youth and human trafficking go. So I first started out with data from Polaris. So Polaris reports that 40% of the homeless population consists of LGBT youth. So while the numbers vary based on where you're looking in the literature, it all ranges from 20 to 40% of LGBT youth still make up this disproportionate percentage of the homeless population, given that only 7% of the general youth population identify as LGBT. So this report also found that, excuse me, that LGBT homeless youth were also more likely to experience sexual violence and exchange sex for things like food, shelter, and medications. So this leads us to ask the question, why are LGBT youth homeless? So this chart was produced by the UCLA Williams Institute from a study done in 2015, and it shows the reasons reported that LGBT youth reported as to why they were homeless. And as you can see, that the top reasons cited by these LGBT individuals were being forced out by their family or running away from their house because of their gender identity or sexual exploitation. So while this list does have other factors that all homeless youth face, the top reason, over half of the individuals were left home because of specific reasons pertaining to their gender identity or sexual orientation. And also you can see this study separated lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals from transgendered individuals. This is an important distinction because transgendered individuals often are more adversely impacted than their gay, lesbian, and bisexual counterparts. And so I also wanted to talk about two different studies to bring it back to homelessness and human trafficking. So these two studies were done in partnership with Covenant House, which is one of the largest private homeless shelters across the US, with numerous locations in a number of different cities in both the US and Canada. And while these studies are limited to interviews in youth who sought care, specifically seeking shelter at Covenant House, they may give us an idea of the overall trends in the homeless population. So the first study was completed by Dr. Laura Murphy of Loyola University in New Orleans. And Dr. Murphy actually spoke at our first symposium 2 years ago. And so her presentation is available online if you'd like to take a look at it. But her study interviewed 641 individuals that were seeking shelter. And most notably, she identified that 19% of these individuals had been trafficked at some point. She also asked them about their gender identity and sexual orientation and found that 29% of the LGBT youth interviewed had been trafficked. 24% had been sex trafficked, which was much larger than the number of seen in non-LGBT youth, which was 12% of the non-LGBT homeless population had been trafficked. Similar results came out of a University of Pennsylvania study also looking at Covenant House, where they interviewed 260 individuals in Philadelphia, Washington, DC, and Phoenix. So looking at all of the individuals that they had identified that had been trafficked, 39% were LGBT. While out of the total number of people they interviewed, only 15% of the total interviewees were LGBT. So again, LGBT individuals were making up a disproportionate percentage of those that had been trafficked. Also in this study, they identified that 22% of all youth who were trafficked were approached on their first night of being homeless, which was sort of a surprising figure to me, that all it took was a single night of being on the streets, and 22% of homeless individuals were already approached to exchange sex for money. So not only did LGBT youth make up a disproportionate number of the homeless population, they were also disproportionately affected by sexual violence and human trafficking. So this suggests that the higher rates of human trafficking seen in the LGBT individuals is not due just to making up a larger proportion of the homeless population, but that there's also other factors involved. So what are these other factors? The big one is discrimination, rejection, and stigmatization. This really is the root cause of many of the challenges facing LGBT individuals, including human trafficking. As we mentioned earlier, family rejection was a common cause of homelessness. So this is also returning to the Williams Institute study. And this is just highlighting some of the factors faced by homeless LGBT youth, with both rejection and bullying being reported at very high levels. LGBT individuals often face stigmatization and rejection in many different aspects of their lives. This includes their family, their friends, their peers, at school, religious organizations, and they experience bullying and violence as well because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And then transgendered individuals are often some of the most stigmatized individuals in our society. And so this discrimination, stigmatization has consequences. When we talk about low self-esteem or the inability to accept who they are because of the influence of others, or being bullied because of an integral part of who they are, as well as losing their support system, all of these factors can be exploited by a trafficker, which put these individuals at higher risk. You can also add another layer of discrimination towards LGBT individuals, and that's the systemic discrimination that exists in this country. So this is looking at housing in specific. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development protects housing for LGBT people who live in housing that receive HUD funds, but otherwise there's little nationwide LGBT protections for housing. So a decent number of states have passed laws banning discrimination on gender identity and sexual orientation, but as you can see, there's still many states that don't offer these protections. And so all of this also places additional stressors on LGBT individuals. And this can make things even worse for these individuals in our communities. And additionally, these fears may manifest themselves in that may ultimately limit access to health care and educational resources for the individuals, which can further place them at risk for human trafficking. And so all of this also puts LGBT individuals at higher risk for mental illness and substance use. And so both mental health, both mental illness and substance use can be exploited by traffickers as well. So LGBT individuals are more likely to be diagnosed with psychiatric diseases like depression, anxiety, PTSD. They're also at increased risk for suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, and completed suicides. There's a higher rate of substance use, including alcohol in the LGBT population. And there's a number of different factors that may contribute to that. Several different researchers have looked at greater social pressures within the LGBT community, as well as the bar scene, where often traditionally the bar scene has been a place, one of the only accepted public spaces to be in for LGBT individuals due to stigma and discrimination. So others have also hypothesized that being a sexual minority has placed a lot of stress on these individuals, and that this has also promoted higher levels of substance use within this group of people. And substance use can put economic strains on individuals, which can be exploited, but also addiction and drug seeking can be exploited by traffickers as well. So how big is the problem? It's really difficult to say. So this is a heat map provided by Polaris from 2011 to 2015 of calls that they categorized as being LGBT cases. So Polaris in 2015 had received 246 substantiated calls from transgender or gender non-conforming individuals, and they'd responded to 304 cases of human trafficking in LGBT individuals from 2011 to 2015. So the thing about this is that call data is not the most reliable means of assessing LGBT involvement in human trafficking, or really all human trafficking. It can only tell you so much. So this map tells us that LGBT individuals are involved in human trafficking across the US, and probably in areas where there are no hotspots on this map as well. Polaris did in 2017 release another report on LGBT cases, and they had only identified 418 of the 31,659 human trafficking cases since they began collecting the data in 2007 as LGBT cases. In this report, they also acknowledged that the number of cases in LGBT individuals was severely underrepresented in this data. They provided two reasons for that. The first being fear of discrimination or being treated poorly, and then distrust of law enforcement. So an LGBT individual who is seeking help, first of all, they may not disclose their identity to the service provider for a number of different reasons, but they also may have been treated poorly in the past by a service provider and would be less likely to disclose their identity. Other factors may include they may not report the trafficking at all out of fear of being outed or having their gender identity or sexual orientation known by others. This distrust of law enforcement may also lead to LGBT individuals not reporting cases of human trafficking as well as other crimes. So this brings us full circle, sort of back around. So one of the root causes creating the problem is also leading to the underrepresentation and barriers to accessing care. And it's important to remember that these individuals are not accessing the resources, so many of them are likely not getting the help that they need. And so sort of what we can do about it, first and foremost, is trauma-informed care. At its core, these individuals have survived human trafficking and should be treated with trauma-informed care. Secondly, we can look at specific, a number of different ways specific to LGBT individuals to foster an inclusive environment, but these also benefit, an inclusive environment benefits everyone as well. So a number of ways of doing this is LGBT individuals, when they are seeking care, they may be looking for any type of sign that shows that they won't be rejected, that they won't be discriminated against. So even something like a small sign can make them feel more welcomed or acknowledged that you are there to help them. So one of the first signs is the intake form. So using inclusive language on the intake form is important. Other things include signs, posters, pamphlets, anything that can show your support or use inclusive language. As a service provider, you can also use inclusive language when speaking to the patients or the whoever the individuals are. That's another important way of demonstrating that you are open and accepting to them, which ultimately results in better care for the individuals. Another aspect is restrooms and changing facilities. Polaris recommends providing access to gender neutral facilities or allowing an individual to use the facility that corresponds with their gender identity. Next, it is important to recognize that LGBT individuals may not self-identify. This really stresses the importance of being inclusive for the sake of everyone, because you really don't know. Unless they tell you, you don't know what an important aspect of someone's history is. So it's best to be inclusive for everyone. An LGBT individual may be uncomfortable. They may not trust you at first. The Department of Justice recognizes that some LGBT trafficking survivors may identify the trafficking as punishment for their sexual orientation or gender identity. And in these circumstances, they may be ashamed and not disclose because of that, because of self-loathing and shame and being ashamed of their sexual orientation. So it's also important to point out that the gender in which they had sexual contact while being trafficked may not be congruent with their sexual orientation. And then Polaris also notes that it's important for seeking, it's important when working with these individuals to seek permission and limit disclosure of sexual orientation to only what is essential. Coming out is a personal choice in which someone must decide every time the individual meets a new person. So by sharing this with someone else, you limit that choice from that individual, which may damage your trust with the survivor. The Department of Justice Human Trafficking Task Force also notes that peer-to-peer support groups can also be helpful for LGBT survivors, as their peers may be more familiar with the unique challenges facing LGBT individuals. So some other things we can do, we can train anyone that comes into contact with survivors, LGBT specific care. So these include healthcare workers, law enforcement, educators. While not healthcare specific, VCU has the Safe Zone program, which is a training available to all VCU staff that sort of provides an introductory workshop on working with LGBT individuals. One of the most important aspects is familiarizing yourself with the available resources that are LGBT friendly in your area. This can really make a huge difference to these individuals because you're ensuring that the LGBT survivor gets the appropriate care. So knowing what services and which ones are in particularly LGBT friendly or where prior LGBT individuals have had good experiences is really useful when helping these individuals. Another factor is Polaris also emphasizes engaging with the larger LGBT community because this helps build credibility within your organization, but also among your providers. And it also provides an opportunity for providers and people interacting with survivors to have a chance to interact with the LGBT community at large. And then just recognizing as a society, we need to work on addressing the root cause, which is really that discrimination, the stigmatization of LGBT individuals, because that's ultimately what is leading to all of these other effects that cause LGBT individuals to be at higher risk for human trafficking. And then I just wanted to end on the survivor preferences. So when we started out the symposium with Tanya and Bella, they went over the survivor preferences with us. So I thought it was important just to end on the survivor preferences that apply to that are important to remember in all cases of trauma, including human trafficking. And those are: treat me with respect and concern, protect me, document with my permission, give me control, have an immediate response, give me options, and be there for me later. And then these are my resources. And then here's our survey. I just put it in at the end. Thank you all for joining us. Since this is the last session of the symposium, if you haven't already, please complete the feedback survey. We'll put the URL in the chat as well, so you can click on it in the chat or scan the QR code with your phone.
While everyone is filling out their survey, hi everybody, this is Faye. I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was an incredible symposium, and I thank you for making it happen for Impact. We're ending our third year. You guys are the third cohort, and every year I am thinking, oh my gosh, it couldn't get better than this. And it does get better. Every year it gets better. It was a pleasure working with you all. Dr. Rigby, Cheryl Bottomer, oh my gosh, my faculty advisors for this elective, thank you for your leadership and your inspiration. Carrie, thank you for holding my hand through this technological nightmare. Carrie was at my house for the first 3 days to make sure I pressed the right buttons. So Carrie, thank you. Gurhas, David, and Ben, fabulous. You guys were awesome. All of you gave great presentations. So thank you so much. Yeah. Congratulations.
Yeah, and I just want to second how much Faye's leadership has meant to everyone over the year, and also Cheryl, who could not be with us this morning, how much support she has given to us, particularly from the helping us develop new simulations that I'm sure will become part of our repertoire. So how much she has been of support to us, and the fantastic contributions. Particular shout out to Carrie for keeping us on track the entire time, and to the other students who are part of the elective this month. Thank you for helping support us and helping create those simulations, which we'll be testing out more next week. And thank everyone for their support, and all of the people who stuck with us through our Saturday symposium, and who've been with us throughout the week. Thank you, everyone, for making this our third symposium another great presentation. And please look for us next year. And also, Faye, if you want to give us information on the virtual symposium that you will be helping host in February, there's yet another opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I was able to get a donation to provide scholarships for up to 10 medical students to attend a regional human trafficking summit. It is HHS's first trafficking summit for Region 3, and that's 5 states, including DC. It's Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and DC. And we've come together to put on this summit, survivor-led, survivor-informed, and it's going to be pretty phenomenal. Carrie will be presenting her paper. It got accepted, so she'll have a video recording. So hopefully we'll have other opportunities to connect with HHS in the incoming year to do things with them. Yeah, so let me know if you want to attend this. This is February 9th and 10th. It's from 10 to 2, so it's 4 hours each day. And the total cost is $65 for both days. And there are CMEs attached to this. So just email me if you want to go.
And also, if you go to Faye's Impact Virginia website, it's also, I think, mentioned on there. Any closing remarks from our students?
Thank you for joining us. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, enjoy your afternoon. Bye-bye.
And don't forget to do the survey.
Yes, okay.
That's how we get the more impetus to go on, and we can convince people we're making a difference.
Yeah, okay.